There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not from the battles or the escapes. Something quieter. Rick's fingers tracing over faded paint on rusted metal, reading words that someone else painted with hope weeks or months ago. Sanctuary for all, the yellow letters promise, half obscured by Georgia dust and rain. His thumb pauses on the word all. Just a small gesture, barely a second, but it carries everything. The weight of every promise that's been broken, every safe place that turned into a trap, every time they thought they'd found something that lasted. What if those words were true this time? What if the railway signs leading to Terminus weren't bait for a trap, but genuine beacons toward something real? Tonight, let's follow that possibility down the tracks, past the cynicism that survival has taught them, into a world where sanctuary means what it says. The four of them have been walking for hours now, their boots finding rhythm on the railroad ties. The sound becomes hypnotic after a while. Step, step, pause for balance. Step, step. Daryl moves like he's hunting, even when they're just walking, his crossbow held loose but ready, his eyes scanning the tree line on both sides. He hasn't said much since they started following the tracks. None of them have. Rick's mind keeps circling back to the prison. 2 weeks since they watched it burn, since they scattered like leaves in a windstorm, since everything they'd built just ended. The governor's tank had rolled right through their front gate, and in the space of an afternoon, the closest thing to home any of them had known in 3 years, became a smoking ruin filled with bodies. Rick's hands still shake sometimes when he thinks about it. Not from fear. The fear has settled into something more permanent, a background hum that he's learned to function around. The shaking comes from rage, pure, impotent rage at how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. Carl walks ahead of him, moving with the careful alertness of someone who's learned that relaxing means dying. He's gotten taller in these past weeks on the road, all elbows and awkward growth spurts that make his sheriff's hat sit differently on his head. Rick watches his son navigate around a gap in the tracks and feels something twist in his chest. Carl shouldn't have to walk like that. Shouldn't have to check shadows and sight lines before taking 3 steps forward. But he does, because that's what this world taught him, and Rick doesn't know how to untangle those lessons without getting them both killed. Another one, Michonne says quietly, pointing with her sword to a tree about 50 yards ahead. Another yellow sign, this one spray-painted on bark. Terminus. Sanctuary for all, community for all, those who arrive survive. Carl stops walking. Those who arrive survive. He tastes the words like they might be poisoned. What kind of promise is that? It's Daryl who answers, the kind that sounds too good. His voice carries that particular weight that all of their voices carry now, the accumulated suspicion of people who've been lied to by the living more than the dead. Ain't nothing free anymore, especially safety. Rick understands the skepticism. God, does he understand it. After Woodbury, after the governor's false hospitality that nearly got them all killed, trusting any new community feels like volunteering for execution. But there's something else moving in him as he stares at that painted promise on the pine bark. Not hope, exactly. He's too careful for hope. But curiosity. The signs aren't just scattered randomly. They're placed deliberately, spaced out like breadcrumbs for the lost. Someone took time to plan this. Someone wanted to be found. We need somewhere, Michonne says. She's been the practical one since they regrouped, the voice that cuts through their trauma to name what they actually need. Can't keep sleeping in cars and hunting rabbits forever. We lost the others, but they're out there somewhere. Maybe following the same signs. The others. Glenn and Maggie. somewhere in the wind. Sasha and Bob and Tyrese, scattered God knows where. Beth, who Daryl won't talk about, and whose absence sits between them like a fourth person. The bus full of people who might be dead, might be running, might be anything. Rick had held them together for so long at the prison, had built something that felt like a future, and now they're just 4 people with whatever they could carry, reading promises painted by strangers. Daryl shifts his weight from one foot to the other, a tell that Rick's learned means he's fighting with himself. Had to leave the Claimers, he says suddenly, not looking at any of them. Before I found y'all again, was rolling with them for a few days after. He doesn't finish the sentence. None of them talk directly about how they got separated in the chaos of the prison's fall. They weren't good people, but they were alive, and they knew how to stay that way. Rick thinks about the bruises on Daryl's face when they reunited, the particular wariness in his eyes that spoke to violence, survived but not forgotten. The Claimers had rules, Daryl told him later. Brutal rules, but clear ones. Rick wonders if Daryl is thinking about that clarity now, looking at these painted promises that might mean anything or nothing. Those signs could be from anybody, Carl says. He's gotten harder in these weeks on the road, more suspicious. Rick recognizes his own survival instincts, flowering in his son, and doesn't know if he should be proud or heartbroken. Could be people like the governor. Could be worse. But Michonne is studying the tree line, the way the tracks curve ahead through a stand of oak trees, the afternoon light filtering through leaves that are just starting to turn. Look how the signs are placed, she says. Not just slapped up anywhere. They're positioned where people would see them if they were following the tracks. Whoever's doing this understands how lost people move. That's what gets to Rick, the intelligence in it. The governor's trap had been all bluster and false grandeur, a performance of civilization designed to overwhelm rather than guide. These signs feel different, patient. Like whoever placed them understood that truly desperate people would be suspicious of anything that sounded too easy, so they made their promise simple and repeatable, and let the desperate decide for themselves. The tracks curve ahead, disappearing into shadow between the trees. In the distance, Rick can see another flash of yellow paint, another promise. Those who arrive survive. It sounds like a dare. It sounds like an invitation. It sounds like exactly the kind of lie that gets people killed. But they're going to follow it anyway, because the alternative is sleeping in another abandoned car tonight, and dividing up another can of peaches 4 ways, and waking up tomorrow to keep walking without a destination, because somewhere ahead, Glenn might be reading the same signs. Maggie might be hoping the same hope. Because Michonne is right. They need somewhere, and these tracks are leading to somewhere specific. Rick adjusts his grip on his Colt python, feels the familiar weight of it against his palm. They'll follow the signs. They'll see what Terminus is. And if it's another trap, if it's another group of people who've decided that civilization means taking what you want from those too weak to stop you, then they'll deal with that too. But as they start walking again, as the rhythm of boots on railroad ties resumes, Rick finds himself thinking about that moment when his thumb traced over the word all. Sanctuary for all. In a world where most promises exclude someone, where safety usually means someone else goes without, what would it mean for somewhere to actually mean all? The afternoon sun slants through the trees ahead of them, and Rick Grimes walks toward Terminus with his family, carrying his suspicion like a weapon and his desperate need for home like a wound, ready for either salvation or another fight. The tracks stretch ahead, leading them somewhere that calls itself sanctuary. Whether that word means what it used to mean is a question they'll find out together, one careful step at a time. The smell hits them first, actual food cooking, not the charred remains of whatever small animal they managed to trap, but something deliberate and seasoned. Steam rises from a large pot tended by a woman with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looks up when they approach the fence, and her smile seems genuine. Not the calculated warmth of someone performing hospitality, just the reflexive friendliness of someone accustomed to feeding hungry people. "You folks following the signs?" she calls out, wiping her hands on a clean apron. Clean. When was the last time Rick saw anyone wearing something clean? "I'm Mary. You look like you could use a good meal." Rick's hand stays close to his gun. This is where it would start. The performance. The too warm welcome designed to lower their guard. He's seen this show before, in Woodbury. The governor had been all smiles and southern charm, too, right up until he wasn't. Rick studies Mary's face, looking for the tells. The two wide eyes, the practiced concern, the way manipulators learn to mirror what desperate people want to see. But Mary just keeps stirring her pot, glancing at them with the casual attention of someone who's done this dozens of times. "You've been walking long. You've got that look, like you've been carrying everything you own for a while now." Darryl shifts beside him, crossbow still ready but not exactly aimed. "Food smells good," he admits, and Rick can hear the hunger in his voice. They've been rationing their last cans for 3 days now. A younger man approaches from inside the compound, tall, brown hair, moving with the careful confidence of someone who's learned to project authority without aggression. "I'm Gareth," he says, stopping a respectful distance from the fence. "Welcome to Terminus. Those are some impressive signs of survival you're wearing." Rick knows this is the test. This is where the leader of this place makes his pitch, reveals what kind of operation they're running. In Woodbury, the governor had talked about rebuilding civilization, while torture chambers hummed in his basement. Rick waits for the slick words, the promises that sound too good, the subtle pressure to surrender their weapons and trust completely. Instead, Gareth says, "Look, I'm not going to lie to you. We've got rules here, and we've got procedures, because that's how we've stayed alive this long. But the core of it is simple. We help each other. We share what we have, and we don't take from others what we can build or find ourselves. If that sounds like something you can work with, we'd be happy to have you. If not, you're welcome to whatever food we can spare, and directions to the next safe-ish area we know about." It's not a sales pitch. It's a job interview. And somehow that makes Rick trust it more than any grand speech about sanctuary might have. Carl steps closer to the fence. "Are there other people here? People like us?" "Few dozen," Gareth says. "Some been here since we got started. Some arrived more recently. Actually, might be some folks you recognize." He calls over his shoulder. "Glenn, you want to come over here?" And then Glenn Rhee is jogging across the courtyard, alive and whole, and grinning like Christmas morning. "Rick, oh man, oh thank God." He's through the gate before anyone can process what's happening, pulling Rick into a hug that feels like coming back to life. Rick finds himself clutching Glenn's shoulders, needing the physical proof that this is real. The others, Maggie's here. Sasha, Bob, Abraham's group too, met them on the road. Glenn pulls back, and his eyes are bright with something Rick hasn't seen in anyone's face for weeks. Hope, actual hope. This place, Rick, it's real. It's actually what they said it was. Michonne's hand finds Rick's arm, a gentle pressure that says, "I told you to keep an open mind." Carl is staring at Glenn like he's seeing a ghost made solid, and Darryl is looking around the compound with the particular attention he gives to places where ambush might be possible, but his shoulders have dropped slightly. The defensive posture is softening. Mary ladles something that looks like actual stew into metal bowls. "Venison," she says, offering them to the group. "Got a few good hunters here, and we've learned to make the most of what we take. Eat first, talk after. That's another rule we've got. Nobody makes big decisions on an empty stomach." Rick accepts the bowl, feels the warmth of it against his palms. The stew smells like herbs he hasn't tasted since before the world ended. Rosemary, maybe, or thyme. Someone here has been gardening. Someone here has time for seasoning, which means someone here has security enough to think about more than just survival. He takes a bite, and it's good. Not just edible, good. The kind of cooking that speaks to patience and practice, and the luxury of caring about flavor. He watches the others eat, watches Carl close his eyes after his first spoonful, watches Darryl make a small sound of appreciation that he probably doesn't realize he made. "How long has this been here?" Michonne asks. Gareth settles cross-legged on the ground near them, casual and unhurried. "Since about 6 months after it all started. My family and some friends, we had this idea that maybe the key to surviving wasn't just staying alive, but staying human. Keeping the parts of civilization that actually mattered." Rick waits for the catch. There's always a catch. "We've had our troubles," Gareth continues. "Groups that thought we'd be an easy target. People who figured a community meant weak people with resources worth taking. But we got lucky. Had some folks with military experience, some with medical training. We learned to defend what we built without becoming the kind of people who just take from others." "What happened to the troublemakers?" Rick asks, because this is important. This is where places like this reveal their true nature. "Depends on the situation," Alex says, joining them from across the compound. Rick recognizes Gareth's younger brother from the family resemblance. "Sometimes we can talk people out of bad ideas. Sometimes we have to convince them to move along. Twice we've had to fight, but we've never had to become killers to stay safe." There's something in the way Alex says it that makes Rick believe him. Not naivety. These people understand violence and its costs, but they've found a way to remain themselves within it. That evening, Rick finds himself sitting on an actual bed for the first time in weeks. Not a cot, not a sleeping bag thrown over concrete, a real bed with sheets that smell like soap. Maggie had cried when she saw Darryl, and Bob had whooped loud enough to wake half the compound when Carl appeared. Sasha had just smiled, one of her rare, genuine smiles that transformed her whole face. Abraham had been characteristically direct. "This place is the real deal, officer. They got their shit together in a way I haven't seen since before everything went sideways." Eugene had nodded earnestly. "The infrastructure is surprisingly sophisticated. They've got sustainable food production, defensible position, organized governance structures. From a survival perspective, this represents optimal resource allocation." Even Rosita, who trusts new situations about as much as Rick does, had admitted, "They're not performing anything. What you see is what they are." Rick stares at the ceiling, actual ceiling, not sky or rust or rotting wood, and tries to process what this means. They're safe. Actually safe for the first time since the farm burned, since Herschel's peaceful world ended in blood and fire. Safe enough that Carl can sleep without keeping one hand on his gun. Safe enough that Darryl agreed to take first shift on the walls rather than sitting awake all night watching their door. But safety has been a lie before. Safety has been the prelude to betrayal, the setup for loss that cuts deeper because hope made it possible. Rick's learned to sleep with one eye open, to assume that every good thing comes with hidden costs. Tomorrow, he thinks, he'll start testing this place properly. He'll find its weaknesses, identify its power structures, figure out where the bodies are buried. Because places like this don't exist without compromise, without someone paying the price for everyone else's peace. But tonight, for the first time in months, Rick Grimes falls asleep to the sound of his son breathing easy in the next bed, in a room with walls that aren't moving and doors that lock from the inside. Tomorrow he'll worry about what this costs, what it means, what it might demand of them. Tonight, he just sleeps. Daryl sits on the wall at 3 a.m, his back against the watchtower post, crossbow across his knees. Below him, Terminus sleeps. Actual sleep, the kind where people don't keep one hand on a weapon and don't wake up at every small sound. The quiet should be peaceful. Instead, it makes his skin crawl. He's been up here for 2 hours now, telling himself he'll go back to the bunk room in just a few minutes. The bed they gave him has clean sheets and a real pillow, softer than anything he's slept on since he was a kid. Maybe that's the problem. Comfort feels like a trap when you've learned that letting your guard down gets people killed. The compound is too quiet. That's what bothers him. Back at the prison, there were always sounds. Walkers shuffling against the outer fence, the wind through broken windows, someone coughing or shifting in their sleep. Here, the silence is so complete it feels artificial, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. Daryl knows he's being paranoid. He's walked the perimeter twice tonight, checked every lock and sight line. The defenses are solid, better than solid. Whoever designed this place understood how to create real security without sacrificing visibility. But knowing something and feeling it are different animals entirely, and his gut still insists that safety this complete can't be real. A door opens below, and Carl emerges from the main building. The kid moves carefully, checking corners out of habit, even though he's walking through the most secure 20 yards of ground he's known in years. He's carrying his gun, Rick's old python visible at his hip, even though Gareth told them weapons weren't necessary inside the walls. Carl looks up and spots Daryl on the wall. After a moment's hesitation, he climbs the ladder to the platform. "Couldn't sleep either?" Carl asks, settling beside him. "Sleep's for people who don't got watch," Daryl says, though they both know someone else is officially on duty tonight. Someone who's actually trained for this, who knows the specific routines and signals Terminus uses. Carl nods like this makes perfect sense. Feels wrong, doesn't it, not having to watch the door? That's exactly it, Daryl realizes. For months now, staying alive has meant constant vigilance. Sleep has been a luxury stolen in shifts, always with someone watching, always with an escape route planned. The idea that they can just close their eyes and trust that they'll wake up the same way they went to sleep feels fundamentally impossible. "Your dad settling in all right?" Daryl asks, though he knows the answer. He saw Rick earlier, sitting with Gareth on the front steps, talking in low voices about resource management and population growth like they were planning for a future that might actually exist. "He's trying," Carl says, "but I catch him doing that thing where he counts exits, and he keeps asking people the same questions, like he's testing their answers." Down in the courtyard, a light comes on in one of the residential buildings. Through the window, Daryl can see Michonne moving around what looks like a small kitchen. Even from this distance, her movements look wrong. Too alert, too ready. She's making herself something to eat, but she's doing it like someone who might need to run at any moment. Think she's having trouble too, Carl observes, following Daryl's gaze. Michonne has always been the practical one, the voice that cuts through their trauma to name what they need. But practicality and trust are different things, and Daryl can see the tension in her shoulders even through the window. She's trying to make herself believe in this place, but her body hasn't gotten the message yet. A few buildings over, another light appears. Glenn and Maggie's room, where they're probably lying awake next to each other, finally in the same bed for the first time since the prison fell, but too wired to actually rest. Daryl wonders if they're talking about the future now, the conversations they couldn't have when survival took all their energy, whether they're planning for tomorrow or still expecting it to be taken away. Bob's been cooking again, Carl says suddenly. Real cooking, not just heating up cans. He asked me to help him make bread yesterday. Actual bread, from scratch. There's something wistful in Carl's voice, and Daryl understands. Bob's joy in simple things has always been infectious, his gratitude a counterweight to their collective cynicism. If anyone can adapt to this place, it should be Bob. But even gratitude can carry guilt when you are alive and others aren't, when you found safety that so many people died looking for. Sasha emerges from another building, moving with the measured steps of someone doing a security sweep. She nods up at them, acknowledging their presence without surprise. Of course she's awake too. Of course she's checking locks that someone else already checked, walking perimeters that are already secured. The habit of vigilance doesn't break just because the danger is temporarily gone. How long you think it takes, Carl asks, to stop feeling like it's all going to disappear? Daryl considers this. How long has it been since any of them felt truly safe? The farm had felt secure until it burned. The prison had felt like home until the governor's tank rolled through their gates. Even Woodbury had felt like salvation to some people, right up until they discovered what the governor really was. Don't know, Daryl says honestly. Maybe never. Maybe that's not the point. Carl shifts beside him, adjusting his grip on the python. Dad keeps saying we can't get comfortable. That comfortable people die. Your dad's not wrong, Daryl says. But there's a difference between staying alert and never letting yourself have anything good. It's a distinction Daryl is still learning himself. Growing up the way he did, good things were always temporary, always came with a price that made them not worth having. Safety meant someone else was about to take something from you. Kindness meant someone wanted something back. The idea that Terminus might be offering genuine sanctuary without hidden costs feels impossible to process. Abraham appears in the courtyard below, doing what looks like equipment checks on the vehicles. Even from this distance, Daryl can see the particular intensity Abraham brings to maintenance tasks, the way he uses familiar work to manage anxiety. Abraham has been the most vocal about appreciating Terminus, calling it squared away and properly organized. But here he is at 3 a.m, making sure their escape routes are functional. Eugene's been drawing maps, Carl observes, watching Abraham work. Maps of routes to Washington, supply caches, fallback positions, like he's planning the mission, but also planning for if we have to run. That sounds right. Eugene's mind works in contingencies, always calculating alternatives and backup plans. The fact that he's found genuine acceptance here doesn't mean he's stopped thinking about what comes next, what could go wrong, how they'd handle evacuation if this peace proves temporary. Rick appears in the courtyard, moving with the careful quiet of someone who doesn't want to wake anyone but needs to check things personally. He speaks briefly with Abraham, both of them gesturing toward the vehicles and the main gate. Even at this distance, Darryl can read their body language. Two men who understand security, taking comfort in shared vigilance. They're all doing it, Carl says quietly. Everyone's awake. Everyone's checking things. He's right. One by one, their people have emerged from their rooms, drawn by insomnia and old habits into the familiar rituals of staying alive. Not because they don't trust Terminus, but because trust is a muscle they've forgotten how to use. Maggie steps out of her building, wearing a robe over pajamas. Actual pajamas. Another small luxury that speaks to how serious this place is about normal life. She walks over to Glenn, who's checking the perimeter fence, and they stand together in comfortable silence. They're not talking, just being near each other in the open air, like the walls of even the safest building still feel too much like a trap. Bob joins them, carrying what looks like a cup of tea. He offers it to Maggie, who accepts it with a smile that's more real than any Darryl has seen from her since the prison fell. These small gestures of care, making food, offering comfort, sharing quiet moments, are what Bob does when the world gets too heavy. His way of insisting on gentleness, even when everything else argues for hardness. Maybe that's how it works, Carl says, watching the small gathering below. Maybe we don't stop being careful. Maybe we just get careful together. Darryl thinks about this as he watches their people check locks and test weapons and maintain equipment in the safety of Terminus's walls. They're not trusting the place to keep them safe. They're trusting each other to stay alert, to notice problems, to maintain the vigilance that's kept them alive this long. It's not the kind of peace Rick probably imagined when he traced those painted words on the railroad signs. Not the complete rest that normal people might expect from Sanctuary. But it might be the only kind of peace that people like them can actually accept. Safety that doesn't require them to stop being the people who survived to reach it. The sun won't rise for hours yet, but already Terminus is quietly awake, filled with people who've forgotten how to sleep without watching but learning, slowly, to watch together. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what peace looks like for people who have seen too much to ever fully let their guard down. Not the absence of vigilance, but the presence of others who understand why vigilance matters. Darryl settles back against the watchtower post, crossbow still ready, eyes still scanning the darkness beyond the walls. But for the first time in months, he's not the only one watching. And somehow, that makes all the difference. There's something different about the way Darryl moves through the woods now. 3 young Terminus residents trailing behind him like eager students. He pauses at a broken branch, points to the subtle depression in the soft earth where a deer passed through, explains how the angle of hoof prints reveals not just direction, but urgency. The kids, because that's what they are, really, 19 and 20-year-olds who've survived by luck and group protection rather than individual skill. Lean in close, absorbing every word. See how the front edge is deeper? Darryl says, crouching beside a track. Means she was moving fast, probably spooked by something. Walkers don't spook deer the same way people do. Deer know walker smell, know walker movement. They run different when it's living predators. One of the students, a young woman named Katie, with careful eyes and steady hands, kneels beside him. How do you tell the difference in the tracks? Darryl considers how to explain something he's known since childhood, knowledge that came from years of following his father through Georgia, backwoods, before the world ended. Weight distribution. When something's really scared of people scared, it puts everything into the front hooves for that first leap. Walkers just make them nervous, so they move more balanced. He feels useful here in a way he hasn't since the prison, not just surviving, not just protecting, but actually teaching something valuable, building skills in other people that might keep them alive when he's not around. It's a strange feeling, being someone others look to for knowledge rather than just firepower. Back at Terminus, Michonne stands before a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area, colored pins marking patrol routes and observation points. Alex and 2 other long-term residents listen as she explains sight lines and rotation schedules, the careful choreography of keeping a community secure without exhausting the people doing the work. The key is overlapping coverage without redundancy, she says, moving her finger along the marked perimeters. You want every approach watched, but you don't want the same person covering the same ground so often they stop really seeing it. This is Michonne in her element. Strategic thinking, tactical planning, the kind of systematic approach to security that keeps large groups alive. She's found something here she couldn't have at the prison, where their defensive needs were simpler, more reactive. Terminus has the population and resources to implement real security protocols, the kind that require someone with her particular combination of experience and analytical thinking. "What about night shifts?" asks Marcus, one of Gareth's original group. "We've been doing 6-hour rotations, but people are getting worn down." 4 hours maximum for night watch, Michonne says immediately. Attention degrades after that, and tired guards are worse than no guards. Better to have more rotations with people who are actually alert. She's teaching them things learned through bitter experience, lessons paid for with the lives of people they couldn't protect when their defenses failed. But here, those hard-earned insights become tools for building something stronger, rather than just memorials to what was lost. In the agricultural section, Glenn and Maggie work alongside Terminus's farming team to expand the garden plots. The existing setup is impressive: raised beds, composting systems, even a small greenhouse built from salvaged windows. But Glenn's eye for efficiency and Maggie's agricultural background from the farm are helping them think bigger. "We could double the yield with vertical growing systems," Glenn explains, sketching plans in the dirt with a stick. "Use the south wall of that building for climbing vegetables. Beans, peas, squash. And if we can find or build some grow lights, the greenhouse could produce year-round." Maggie nods, running her hands through soil that's been carefully maintained and enriched. The composting system is solid, but we're not processing nearly enough organic matter. Food scraps, yard waste from clearing operations. We're missing opportunities. They're planning for permanence in a way they couldn't afford at the prison, where every resource had to serve immediate survival needs. Here they can think about next year's harvest, about building systems that will support a larger population, about the kind of long-term food security that makes real civilization possible. Abraham has found his calling in the workshop area, where Terminus maintains their vehicles and equipment. His military logistics background makes him invaluable for organizing supply chains and maintenance schedules. But more than that, he's helping them think strategically about their capabilities. "You've got good defensive positions," he tells Gareth over the sound of an engine being tuned, "but your mobility options are limited. If something forces evacuation, you can't move your whole population quickly enough." Gareth wipes grease from his hands, considering this. "We've been focused on making this place strong enough that evacuation wouldn't be necessary." "Smart thinking. But you need backup plans," Abraham says. "I'm not talking about abandoning this place. I'm talking about expanding it. Satellite locations, supply caches, established routes between friendly communities. Make your network strong enough that losing any single point doesn't mean losing everything." It's the kind of strategic thinking that requires believing in a future, in the possibility of growth rather than just survival. Abraham is helping them plan for success, rather than just preparing for failure. Eugene has claimed a corner of the communications building, where Terminus runs their radio equipment. His technical knowledge is already improving their broadcast range and clarity, but he's also working on something more ambitious, a comprehensive communication network that could coordinate survivor communities across multiple states. The infrastructure's mostly intact, he explains to a fascinated audience of Terminus tech specialists. Relay towers, satellite coverage, even some government emergency channels. With the right equipment and proper transmission protocols, we could establish reliable long-distance communication. His Washington, D.C. mission has evolved from a desperate journey into something more systematic, using Terminus as a base of operations to gradually rebuild the technological infrastructure that makes modern society possible. It's ambitious in a way that would have seemed impossible when they were just trying to stay alive day by day. Carl has found his own place among Terminus's younger residents, but in a way that surprises Rick. Instead of just making friends, Carl has become something of a mentor to kids who grew up in the community, who never learned the hard-edged survival skills that kept Rick's group alive. Rick watches from across the courtyard as Carl teaches a group of 12 and 13-year-olds basic knife combat, not because they're expecting to fight walkers tomorrow, but because these skills might save their lives if the community's defenses ever fail. Carl's approach is methodical, patient. He's passing on knowledge that he desperately hopes these kids will never need, but knows they should have. Balance is everything, Carl tells them, demonstrating a proper stance. If you can't keep your footing, the best technique in the world won't help you. These kids look at Carl with something approaching awe, not because he's older than them, but because he represents survival skills they've only heard about in stories. He's lived through the collapse, fought his way across hostile territory, survived things that their protected upbringing never exposed them to. That evening, Rick finds himself in Gareth's office, bent over maps and population charts, planning for growth that seemed impossible just weeks ago. They're discussing housing expansion, resource allocation, the delicate balance of accepting new survivors without straining their systems. We've got 3 more groups that have radioed in, Gareth says, pointing to marks on the map. 1 from Alabama, 2 from North Carolina. All of them have heard the broadcasts and want to know if the sanctuary offer is real. Rick studies the numbers: current population, food production capacity, security requirements. It's the kind of planning he did as a sheriff's deputy, thinking about community resources and public safety, but applied to a world where every decision carries life or death consequences. How do we vet them? Rick asks. How do we know they're not like the governor's people? Same way we figured out you weren't, Gareth says simply. Carefully, with backup plans, and by trusting our instincts about people while verifying everything we can. It's a measured approach that acknowledges the risks while refusing to let fear prevent growth. Rick finds himself appreciating Gareth's steady confidence, the way he balances caution with optimism, security with hospitality. 3 weeks ago, Rick was following railroad signs toward an uncertain destination, carrying nothing but weapons and suspicion, and the desperate hope that his scattered family might somehow survive. Now he's planning housing developments and security protocols, thinking about radio networks and agricultural expansion, helping to build something that might outlast all of them. Bob appears in the doorway with a tray of coffee, actual coffee, traded from another community that specializes in luxury goods, and Rick accepts a cup gratefully. The simple pleasure of hot coffee, shared with people who are becoming friends rather than just allies, feels like a small miracle. Supply run tomorrow, Bob says, settling into a chair. Abraham's put together a route that hits 3 different resource sites and makes contact with that group outside Macon. Should be back by evening if everything goes smooth. Rick nods, then realizes what Bob just said. Supply run. Routine logistics, planned and scheduled rather than desperate scavenging. The kind of organized operation that communities do when they're stable enough to think beyond immediate needs. "Who's going?" Rick asks. "Me, Abraham, Eugene, couple of the locals who know the territory," Bob says. Darrell wants to stay and work with the hunting teams, and Michonne's got security briefings scheduled. They're spreading out, taking on different responsibilities, becoming integrated into the community's operations rather than just grateful guests. It's a level of trust and investment that Rick didn't expect to feel again. The sense that they're building something worth protecting rather than just surviving until the next crisis. Outside, the sounds of Terminus settling into evening. Conversations on porches, children's laughter. The everyday noise of people who feel safe enough to be loudly human. Rick listens to it while he reviews population projections and resource allocation charts, planning for a future that includes all of them. Tomorrow they'll run supplies and make contact with new survivors. Next week they'll break ground on the housing expansion. Next month they'll have radio contact with communities as far away as Tennessee and South Carolina. It's the kind of forward thinking that was impossible when every day was focused on just making it to the next one. Rick finishes his coffee and heads back to the residential building, where his son is probably doing homework, actual homework, from books salvaged from a nearby school, and where he has a room with a door that locks and windows that open, and the expectation that he'll wake up in the same place tomorrow morning. For the first time since the world ended, Rick Grimes is helping to build something, rather than just trying to survive the loss of everything else. And somehow, against all odds and expectations, it feels like coming home. Marcus comes back from his morning patrol with dirt on his knees and worry in his eyes, the kind of expression that makes everyone in the radio room stop what they're doing and pay attention. He's been running, not jogging, running, and the sweat on his forehead has nothing to do with the Georgia heat. "Large group," he says, still catching his breath. Maybe 30, 40 people, armed, organized, moving this direction along the main road. They're not walkers, they're not lost, and they're not being subtle about it. Rick feels something familiar wake up in his chest. That cold, focused readiness that kept him alive as a deputy and sharpened into something harder during the prison years. His hand moves instinctively toward his gun, muscle memory from dozens of threats that turned out to be exactly as bad as they first appeared. Gareth sets down his coffee cup with deliberate calm. How far out? 6 miles, maybe 8, moving steady but not rushing, like they know where they're going. Marcus accepts a water bottle from Eugene, drinks deeply before continuing. Thing is, they've got families with them. Kids, elderly folks. But the armed people are positioned like an escort, not like parents. That changes things, and Rick can see the same calculation happening in everyone else's eyes. A purely military group would be one kind of problem, straightforward hostile intent that you meet with overwhelming force. Families change the math, introduce variables that don't resolve cleanly with violence. Could be refugees, Alex suggests, but his voice carries doubt. Another community that got overrun, looking for sanctuary. Could be, Darrell says from the doorway, where he's been listening with the particular stillness he gets when something doesn't smell right. Or could be bait, use the families to get close, count our defenses, figure out our weak spots before the real attack. It's the kind of cynical calculation that Rick recognizes from his own thinking, the assumption that kindness is usually a weapon and trust is usually a mistake. The prison taught him that the most dangerous threats come wrapped in reasonable explanations and sympathetic faces. But Gareth is shaking his head, not in disagreement, but in something that looks like disappointment. "We can't start from the assumption that everyone's lying," he says. "If we do that, we become the kind of place that shoots first and asks questions later." "The kind of place that stays alive," Rick counters, and the words come out harder than he intended. "You want to risk everyone here on the chance that these people are exactly what they appear to be." The room goes quiet, and Rick realizes they've just reached the conversation that was always going to happen eventually. The philosophical divide between Terminus's idealistic approach and the brutal pragmatism that kept Rick's group breathing through 3 years of constant threats. Carl speaks up from where he's been listening, near the communications equipment. "What if they're like us? What if they're just scared people who've lost everything and don't know who to trust?" There's something in his son's voice that makes Rick pause. Not naivety, but a kind of hopeful determination. Carl has seen as much violence as anyone in this room, has killed to protect the people he loves. But he's choosing to believe in the possibility that not every approaching group represents a threat. Michonne steps forward, her katana still at her side, but her posture suggesting thought rather than action. "There's a middle path here," she says, looking between Rick and Gareth. "We don't have to choose between blind trust and preemptive violence." She moves to the map table, tracing routes with her finger. "Send a small scouting party to observe and make contact from a distance. Get actual information about their intentions and capabilities before we decide how to respond." It's classic Michonne, finding the tactical solution that preserves options while gathering intelligence. Rick appreciates the strategic thinking, but his gut still insists that by the time you know for certain that someone wants to hurt you, it's often too late to stop them. Abraham joins the conversation with the blunt efficiency that military experience brings to crisis planning. "Scouting party makes sense, but we also need to assume worst case and prepare accordingly. Lock down non-combatants, establish firing positions, make sure our evacuation routes are clear." Gareth nods slowly, and Rick can see him processing the balance between maintaining their principles and acknowledging the reality of threat. "Okay. Scouting mission to establish contact and assess intentions, defensive preparations in case diplomacy fails, but we try talking first." "And if talking gets our people killed?" Rick asks. "Then we fight," Gareth says simply. "But we don't start there. We can't start there, or we stop being the kind of community worth protecting." Over the next few hours, Rick watches Terminus transform in ways that both impress and concern him. The defensive preparations are thorough and well-organized. Eugene coordinates communications, Michonne establishes firing positions and sight lines, Abraham oversees weapons distribution and ammunition supplies. But none of it feels panicked or desperate. There's a methodical quality to their preparations that speaks to planning and practice rather than improvisation. The non-combatants move to secure areas without argument or resistance. They trust their leadership enough to follow orders. But more than that, they seem to genuinely believe that this threat will be managed competently and ethically. It's the kind of community confidence that Rick hasn't seen since the early days at the farm, before they learned how quickly safety could be stripped away. Daryl and Abraham volunteer for the scouting mission, and Rick finds himself in the unusual position of staying behind while others gather intelligence. It chafes against every instinct he's developed about leadership and responsibility, but it's also a test of whether he can trust other people to make decisions that affect his family's safety. Carl finds him on the wall as the sun begins to set, watching the road where the approaching group will eventually appear. You think they're bad people? Carl asks. Rick considers this. I think people get desperate, he says finally. And desperate people do things they wouldn't normally do. That doesn't make them evil, but it can make them dangerous. But we were desperate too, Carl points out. When we were following those railroad signs, hoping Terminus was real. What if someone had decided we were dangerous before they gave us a chance? It's a fair question, and one that cuts to the heart of Rick's discomfort with Gareth's approach. They did arrive at Terminus armed and suspicious, carrying the kind of hardened wariness that could easily be mistaken for hostile intent. If Terminus had met them with preemptive violence, his family would be dead. Glenn and Maggie joined them on the wall, both armed but not tense. Any word from the scouts? Maggie asks. Not yet, Rick says. Should hear something in the next hour or two. Glenn leans against the parapet, looking out at the peaceful Georgia countryside that could turn hostile at any moment. Strange how quickly you start thinking about defending something instead of just running from threats. Maggie nods, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. We can't keep running forever. Eventually you have to decide what's worth staying to fight for. Rick glances at her, noticing the gesture. Is she? The possibility of new life, of children born into this sanctuary rather than the wasteland outside its walls, changes the stakes in ways that make his protective instincts even sharper. The radio crackles to life, and Daryl's voice comes through clearly. Base, this is Scout Team. Making visual contact now. Confirming approximately 40 individuals, mix of ages. They're definitely organized, but they're not moving like raiders. Abraham's voice follows. Weapons are defensive posture, not assault formation. These people look scared, not predatory. Like refugees from something bad, not wolves looking for sheep. Rick feels some of the tension ease in his shoulders, but he doesn't relax completely. Scared people can be just as dangerous as malicious ones, sometimes more so, because fear makes people unpredictable. Gareth's voice comes over the radio. Can you establish peaceful contact? A long pause, then Daryl again. Working on it. They've got someone who wants to talk. Guy in his 50s, says his name's David. Claims they're from a community outside Augusta that got overrun yesterday. They've been walking since dawn, heard our broadcasts. Another fallen community. Rick thinks about the dozens of places he's seen fail. Camps that couldn't hold, settlements that trusted the wrong people, communities that made one mistake too many and paid for it with everything. The governor's assault on the prison was just one version of a story that plays out constantly across the wasteland. Eugene's voice joins the radio chatter. Confirming their broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Signal strength and equipment suggest legitimate survivors, not raiders with stolen gear. As the evening progresses, the picture becomes clearer. David's community had lasted 2 years before a coordinated attack by a group calling themselves the Reapers overwhelmed their defenses. The survivors scattered, with David's group following Terminus's radio broadcasts in the hope of finding sanctuary. By the time Daryl and Abraham return with David and 2 other representatives, Rick has watched Terminus's diplomatic process play out in real time. Careful verification, cautious contact, incremental trust building based on observable evidence rather than assumptions. David is exactly what he claimed to be, an exhausted leader carrying the weight of community failure, desperate to find safety for the people who survived his settlement's collapse. He's not performing desperation or hiding predatory intent. He's just a man who's lost almost everything and found himself responsible for the lives of others. Gareth handles the negotiations with the same steady competence he brings to everything else. Housing will be provided temporarily, while the newcomers decide whether Terminus is where they want to stay permanently. Integration will be gradual, with established residents mentoring newcomers in community protocols and expectations. It's exactly the process Rick's group went through, and watching it from the other side gives him a new appreciation for how much trust Terminus extended to them, based on limited information and educated guesses about character. Later that evening, Rick finds himself in conversation with David over coffee and a meal that Mary prepared for the newcomers. "How do you know?" Rick asks. "How do you know we weren't the kind of people who'd take what you have and leave you with nothing?" David looks surprised by the question. "Same way you knew we weren't raiders, I figure. You watch people, you listen to how they talk, you see whether their actions match their words. Most bad people aren't that good at pretending to be good for extended periods. And if you're wrong, then you're wrong," David says simply. "But if you assume everyone's dangerous, you never get to find out who might be trustworthy. And trustworthy people are what make survival into something worth surviving for." Rick thinks about this as Terminus settles back into its evening routines. 40 new residents settling into temporary housing. Children from David's group already connecting with Terminus kids. Adults beginning the careful process of integration that will determine whether these two groups can become one community. Tomorrow there will be new challenges, resource allocation, housing assignments, the delicate work of expanding their population without straining their systems. But tonight, Rick watches his son help newcomer children find sleeping arrangements, watches Michonne coordinate security briefings that include David's most experienced people, watches Glenn and Maggie discuss expanded agricultural plans with David's farming specialists. They chose trust over fear, diplomacy over preemption, and it worked. The approaching threat turned into new community members, additional skills and knowledge, more hands to share the work of building something that lasts. Rick still believes in being ready for violence, still thinks preparedness and defensive capability are essential for any community's survival. But he's beginning to understand that Gareth's approach isn't naive idealism. It's a different kind of strength, the courage to extend trust even when that trust could be dangerous. As he heads back to his room, Rick passes the window where the radio equipment broadcasts their nightly message into the Georgia darkness. Sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive, survive. Tonight, 40 more people proved that promise true. And for the first time since the world ended, Rick Grimes goes to sleep believing that maybe, just maybe, trust might be a more powerful survival tool than fear. The argument starts over something small: which group gets to use the workshop space during the afternoon shift. But Rick can see the real tensions beneath the surface. It's been 3 days since David's people arrived, and the careful politeness that marked their first interactions is starting to crack under the pressure of shared resources and competing needs. "We had this scheduled weeks ago," says Janet, one of Terminus's original residents, her voice tight with frustration. "The irrigation system repairs can't wait, just because new people want to fix their truck." David's mechanic, a young man named Tommy, with grease-stained hands and defensive shoulders, gestures toward the vehicle in question. "That truck carries half our medical supplies. You want us to leave medicine sitting in broken-down transportation while we wait our turn for workspace?" It's a reasonable argument on both sides, which makes it exactly the kind of conflict that can't be solved by simple authority or clear rules. Rick watches Gareth navigate the dispute with the careful attention of someone learning how his leadership style translates to a larger, more complex community. "The irrigation work affects food production for everyone," Gareth says, his voice deliberately calm. But medical access is obviously critical too. What if we split the workshop time? Mornings for scheduled maintenance, afternoons available for emergency repairs. Tommy shakes his head. This isn't emergency work. It's preventive maintenance. That truck breaks down completely. We lose more than just transportation. We lose the mobile medical kit, the portable radio, the emergency supplies. Janet crosses her arms. So your truck is more important than our food system? And there it is, the fundamental tension that Rick knew was coming. Not your truck and our food system, but your people and our community. The invisible line between established residents and newcomers, between those who built this place and those who arrived to benefit from that work. Carl steps forward from where he's been listening, near the workshop entrance. What if the problem isn't the schedule, he says. What if the problem is that we only have one workshop for 60 people instead of 40? It's a perceptive observation that cuts through the immediate conflict to address the structural issue. Rick feels a familiar surge of pride in his son's ability to think beyond the obvious problem toward underlying causes. Abraham appears from the direction of the residential buildings, Eugene trailing behind him with an armload of expansion planning documents. Already on it, kid, Abraham says. Eugene and I have been working on infrastructure scaling. We need more workspace, more housing, more storage capacity. Eugene adjusts his papers, launching into explanation mode. Current population growth exceeds planned capacity by approximately 30%. Without expansion of physical infrastructure, resource allocation conflicts will increase exponentially. Michonne joins the group, drawn by the raised voices and the gathering crowd. Rick sees her assess the situation quickly, not just the immediate dispute, but the way people are positioning themselves, the body language that reveals deeper divisions. This is about more than workshop space, she says, looking between Janet and Tommy. This is about how we make decisions when we don't all want the same things. Janet's frustration spills over. It's about not changing everything we've built just because new people show up with different priorities. And it's about not being treated like charity cases who should be grateful for whatever scraps we get, Tommy responds, his defensive posture hardening into something more combative. Rick recognizes this moment, the point where a community either learns to handle internal conflict constructively or splits apart along factional lines. He's seen it happen before, watched groups fracture over smaller disagreements than this one. David appears from the direction of the temporary housing area, moving with the careful diplomacy of someone who understands that his people's acceptance depends partly on how well they handle their first major integration challenge. Tommy, he says quietly, let's talk about this. But Tommy is past talking. No, David. I'm tired of being careful about everything we say and do. We're not guests here. We're community members. We deserve the same access to resources as everyone else. It's a fair point, but Rick can see how it lands with the original Terminus residents. They took risks to accept David's group, shared resources and space, extended trust based on limited information. Now they're being told they should treat newcomers as equal stakeholders from day one. Bob emerges from the medical building, drawn by the commotion, and Rick sees him assess the situation with the particular attention he gives to problems that threaten community cohesion. Bob has been working with David's group to integrate their medical knowledge and supplies, building relationships through shared professional purpose. What if we step back from the immediate problem? Bob suggests. Both groups have legitimate needs. The question is how we prioritize competing demands fairly. Sasha joins him, her security background giving her a different perspective on group dynamics and conflict resolution. Seems like the real issue is that we need better systems for handling resource conflicts, she says. clear procedures that everyone understands and agrees to follow. Gareth nods slowly. A community council, maybe. Representatives from different groups and areas of expertise. When we can't resolve disputes through informal discussion, we have a structured way to make decisions. Rick watches this unfold with mixed feelings. Part of him appreciates the democratic approach, the commitment to fairness and inclusion. But another part, the part shaped by constant crisis leadership, worries that formal processes slow down decision-making when quick action might be necessary. Who chooses the representatives? Carl asks. It's a practical question that goes to the heart of democratic governance. Who gets to decide how decisions get made? We all do, Michonne says. Community-wide selection, with representation proportional to group size and expertise areas. Over the next few hours, Rick watches Terminus transform its approach to internal governance. What started as a workshop scheduling dispute becomes a comprehensive discussion about community decision-making, resource allocation, and the balance between established precedent and newcomer needs. Eugene and Abraham present their infrastructure expansion plans, showing how additional workspace and housing can accommodate population growth while maintaining community cohesion. The timeline is aggressive. 6 weeks to build additional workshop space, expand the residential area, and create more storage capacity. David's group commits to providing labor and expertise for the expansion, while Terminus's original residents agree to share decision-making authority through the new council system. It's not perfect. There are still tensions about priorities and implementation details, but it's a framework for managing future conflicts. That evening, the community gathers for what Bob calls a sharing circle, an informal chance for people from different groups to tell their stories, explain their backgrounds, and begin building personal connections that transcend the newcomer versus established divide. Rick listens as David describes his community's 2-year run, the careful balance of security and openness that ultimately couldn't protect them from a coordinated assault by the group calling itself the Reapers. There are echoes of the prison in David's story, the same hope for permanence, the same careful construction of normalcy, the same sudden, violent end. Janet talks about Terminus's early days, the struggles to establish security and sustainability, the gradual growth from desperate survival to genuine community. Her pride in what they built is evident, but so is her fear that rapid expansion might undermine the careful systems that made their success possible. Tommy shares his frustration about being viewed as a charity case rather than a contributing member, his expertise in vehicle maintenance and repair dismissed because he comes from a failed community. Just because our place didn't make it doesn't mean we don't know how to build something that lasts, he says. One by one, people share not just their stories, but their skills, their hopes, their concerns about integrating 2 different groups with different histories and approaches to survival. Rick realizes he's watching the birth of something larger than either original community, a hybrid approach that combines Terminus's principled governance with David's group's hard-won practical knowledge. Maggie stands up when it's her turn, one hand resting on her stomach in the unconscious gesture that Rick has noticed more frequently. "Glenn and I have been talking about children," she says, and the evening gathering goes completely quiet, about what kind of world we want to build for them, about whether this place can be somewhere kids can grow up safely. She looks around the circle, making eye contact with people from both groups. I think what happened today, the argument, the discussion, the way we worked through it, that's exactly what gives me hope. We had a problem, we disagreed about solutions, and we figured out a way forward that works for everyone. Glenn nods, reaching for her hand. David's group brings different experiences, different knowledge. That makes us stronger, not weaker. As long as we can keep talking through problems, instead of letting them divide us. Carl speaks up from his spot near Rick. At the prison, we never really had to figure out how to include new people. Either they fit in with what we already had, or they didn't stay. This is harder, but it's better. Rick understands what his son means. The prison's approach had been simpler. Newcomers adapted to existing systems or left. But that approach also meant they never grew beyond their original limitations, never gained new perspectives or capabilities. As the evening winds down, Rick finds himself talking with David about leadership challenges, the weight of making decisions that affect other people's survival, the difficulty of balancing idealism with pragmatism. "You did good today," Rick tells him. "Letting your people express their frustrations without shutting them down, but also helping them find constructive ways to address problems." David shrugs. Tommy's not wrong about being treated like charity cases. We need to earn our place here through contribution, not just gratitude. But that means we also have to be willing to adapt to how this community operates. And this community has to be willing to adapt to having you, Rick says. Growth changes things. The question is whether it changes them for the better. Later, as Rick settles into his room for the night, he thinks about the day's events. The workshop dispute could have fractured the community along newcomer versus established lines. Instead, it became an opportunity to develop better systems for handling future conflicts. Tomorrow they'll start construction on the infrastructure expansion, begin implementing the community council system, continue the slow work of turning two groups into one community. There will be more conflicts, more growing pains, more moments when the easy thing would be to divide along familiar lines rather than do the harder work of integration. But tonight, Rick goes to sleep in a community that chose to grow rather than exclude, to adapt rather than maintain rigid boundaries. It's messier than the simple hierarchies that crisis leadership requires, but it's also more sustainable than any approach that depends on one person making all the decisions. For the first time since becoming a leader, Rick Grimes falls asleep, knowing that the community's future doesn't depend entirely on his judgment. They're building something that can survive and adapt even if any individual leader fails, including him. Outside his window, the sounds of Terminus settling into night include voices from David's group and original residents talking quietly on porches, sharing stories, making plans. 60 people learning to be one community, one decision at a time. The morning head count shows 83 people, which means another family arrived during the night without advance radio contact. Rick stands in the communications building, looking at the updated population charts, while Eugene adjusts the broadcast equipment to handle increased transmission volume. 3 weeks ago, they were celebrating successful integration with David's group. Now they're receiving new arrivals almost daily. That's the 4th group this week, Gareth says, running his fingers through hair that's gotten grayer since they started expanding. The radio broadcasts are reaching farther than we anticipated. Eugene looks up from his equipment modifications, pushing his glasses up his nose. Signal amplification improvements increased our broadcast range by approximately 60%. Conservative estimates suggest we're now reaching survivor populations within a 3-state radius. It's a success that feels like a problem. Rick studies the resource allocation charts scattered across the table. Food production, housing capacity, security requirements, medical supplies. Every line trends upward at angles that make his deputy's training nervous about sustainability and crisis planning. How many can we actually support? Rick asks. Gareth spreads his hands in a gesture that acknowledges the complexity of the question. Depends on how fast we can expand infrastructure, how quickly new people integrate and start contributing, how much strain we can put on existing systems without something breaking. Abraham appears in the doorway, carrying folders thick with construction plans and resource projections. Just finished the housing assessment, he says, settling the papers on the table. We can accommodate maybe 20 more people in temporary housing, but after that we're looking at serious overcrowding until the new residential buildings are complete. The construction timeline is ambitious, but realistic. 6 weeks to complete the first new housing block, 12 weeks for the expanded workshop and storage facilities. But 12 weeks assumes no major crises, no significant labor shortages, no supply chain disruptions in a world where supply chains depend on scavenging and trading with other survivor communities. Carl enters the communications building with the confident stride of someone who's found his place in the community's hierarchy. At 16, he's become one of Terminus's most valuable assets for orienting new arrivals, especially families with children who need someone closer to their own age to help them understand how this place works. The Patterson family is settling in okay, Carl reports. Kids are scared but adapting. Parents are asking about work assignments and permanent housing timeline. Rick feels the familiar pride watching his son handle responsibilities that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Carl has grown into the kind of person who makes frightened children feel safe, who can explain community rules without making them sound like restrictions, who bridges the gap between adult authority and peer understanding. Any problems? Gareth asks. Nothing serious. The youngest kid is having nightmares. Been on the road for 3 months since their last community fell apart. But Bob's working with the family on that. Michonne joins them from the direction of the main gate, carrying the particular alertness that comes from managing security for a rapidly growing population. Just completed patrol assignments for the expanded perimeter, she says, unrolling a hand-drawn map marked with colored pins. We're stretching our experienced people thin, trying to cover the additional territory. The security challenges multiply with each new arrival. More people means larger defensive perimeters, more entry points to monitor, more potential for internal conflicts, more complexity in distinguishing between residents and threats. Michonne has been developing protocols for managing security in a growing community. But protocols only work if you have enough trained people to implement them. What about recruiting from the new arrivals? Abraham suggests. David's group has some people with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Already working on it, Michonne says. But training takes time, and trust takes longer. I'm not putting someone on patrol until I know how they handle stress and uncertainty. The conversation is interrupted by commotion from the main courtyard. Raised voices, not quite argument, but heading in that direction. Rick follows the others outside to find 2 groups of newcomers in heated discussion about resource allocation, specifically who gets access to the limited shower facilities during peak hours. It's the 3rd such dispute this week, and Rick recognizes the pattern. Individual conflicts about small things that represent larger tensions about fairness, hierarchy, and who gets to make decisions about shared resources. The kind of friction that's inevitable when you're trying to blend multiple groups of traumatized people into a single functioning community. Darryl emerges from the workshop building, wiping motor oil from his hands and bringing his particular perspective on group dynamics. Getting crowded in here, he observes, watching the argument unfold. Maybe it's time to think about spreading out some. It's a practical suggestion that addresses multiple problems simultaneously. Population pressure, resource strain, security vulnerabilities from having everyone concentrated in one location. Darryl has been scouting locations for satellite communities, places within reasonable travel distance that could house some of the population while maintaining connection to the main Terminus settlement. Satellite communities would need their own leadership structures, Rick points out. People willing to take responsibility for smaller groups, infrastructure to support independent operations. Got people who could handle it, Darrell says. David's shown he knows how to lead a community. Some of the other group leaders who've arrived recently have experience managing resources and making decisions. Gareth looks thoughtful as he watches the shower dispute resolve itself through negotiation and compromise. It would reduce pressure here, he admits, but it also means we're betting on our ability to maintain coordination between multiple locations. That afternoon, the Community Council meets for its first official session since being established. Rick finds himself in the unfamiliar position of being one voice among many rather than the final authority on major decisions. The council includes representatives from each of the major groups that have joined Terminus, along with specialists in key areas like medical care, security, and resource management. The agenda is overwhelming: housing expansion timeline, resource allocation protocols, satellite community establishment, new arrival processing procedures, conflict resolution systems. Each item represents hours of discussion and complex trade-offs between competing priorities. We can't accept every group that shows up, says Janet, representing the original Terminus residents. We're already pushing our systems to the breaking point. David nods, but with the qualification that comes from his own experience as a refugee. But we can't just start turning away desperate people either. That's not what this place is supposed to be. Glenn raises his hand for attention. What if we're thinking about this wrong? What if instead of just growing Terminus bigger, we help people establish their own communities using what we've learned here? Maggie shifts beside him, one hand resting on her stomach in the gesture that's become more noticeable as her pregnancy progresses. Glenn's right. We could be a training center for community leadership, a place where people learn how to build sustainable settlements before going out to establish their own. It's an ambitious vision that transforms Terminus from a single sanctuary into the hub of a network of allied communities. Instead of trying to house every survivor who hears their broadcasts, they become a resource for teaching others how to create their own versions of what they've built. Abraham leans forward, interested. That could work for the Washington mission, too. Instead of one risky journey with a small group, we establish a chain of allied communities between here and D.C. Each one provides support and supply for the next stage. Eugene, who has been mostly quiet during the discussion, speaks up with characteristic precision. Distributed network architecture would provide redundancy and resilience. Single point of failure risks are significantly reduced when essential resources and knowledge are spread across multiple nodes. Bob raises a practical concern. Teaching people to build their own communities means giving away what makes us special. What if we train our competition instead of our allies? Michonne shakes her head. Communities that can sustain themselves are allies by definition. Competition happens when people are fighting over scarce resources. If everyone has access to sustainable systems, there's less reason for conflict. The discussion continues for hours, moving through logistics and philosophy, practical concerns and ambitious possibilities. Rick watches his fellow council members wrestle with questions that have no easy answers, finding solutions through collaboration rather than authority. By evening, they've reached a preliminary agreement. Terminus will begin accepting a limited number of new residents, while simultaneously developing a program to train community leaders and help establish satellite settlements. It's a compromise that acknowledges both their capacity limitations and their responsibility to help other survivors. That night, Rick finds himself walking the expanded perimeter with Darrell, checking security measures and discussing the day's decisions. The community now spreads across more territory than the original Terminus founders ever imagined needing, with temporary housing structures and work areas creating a small town rather than just a fortified compound. "Think we're biting off too much?" Darrell asks. Rick considers this while watching the lights in windows that represent families who were sleeping in cars and abandoned buildings just weeks ago. Maybe. But the alternative is watching people die while we sit on resources that could help them. Governor thought he was helping people too, Darrell points out, right up until he decided some people mattered more than others. It's a sobering reminder of how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes when leadership loses sight of its principles. Rick thinks about the council meeting, the careful negotiation and compromise, the decision-making process that includes multiple voices and perspectives. "Difference is we're not making these decisions alone," Rick says. "Hard to become a dictator when you have to convince a council of your ideas before implementing them." They complete their circuit of the perimeter and head back toward the residential areas, where the sounds of 83 people settling into sleep create a gentle background noise. Children's laughter from one building, quiet conversation between adults on a porch, the soft closing of doors and windows as families secure themselves for the night. 3 months ago, Rick was following painted signs toward an uncertain destination, hoping for sanctuary and expecting betrayal. Tonight, he's part of a community that's struggling with the problems of success rather than survival, growth rather than stagnation, abundance rather than scarcity. Tomorrow they'll break ground on the new housing construction, send a scouting party to evaluate potential satellite locations, begin developing curriculum for training community leaders. The radio will broadcast their message to survivor communities across the southeast, and more desperate people will begin the journey toward Terminus. It's messy and complicated and uncertain in ways that simple survival never was. But it's also the closest thing to actual civilization that Rick has seen since the world ended. Not just staying alive, but building something worth living for. As he heads back to his room, Rick passes Carl's door and hears his son quietly talking with someone. Probably one of the newer arrivals who's having trouble sleeping in an unfamiliar place. Carl's voice is patient and reassuring, offering the kind of comfort that only someone who's survived the worst can provide to others facing similar fears. Rick goes to sleep, listening to the sound of his son helping a frightened child feel safe in a world that's learning to be safe again. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new people, new complications. But tonight, Terminus is home to 83 people who have somewhere to sleep without keeping one eye open, somewhere to dream about futures beyond mere survival. For the first time since becoming a leader, Rick Grimes falls asleep, knowing that the work of building something better is too big for any one person to handle alone. And somehow, that feels like the safest thing of all. The map in the communications building now shows red lines connecting Terminus to 12 other communities across Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee, trade routes that carry more than just supplies. They carry ideas, skills, news, and the gradual rebuilding of something larger than any individual settlement could achieve alone. Rick studies the newest addition to the network, a mark labeled Hilltop, about 40 miles northwest. The community specializes in agriculture and metalworking, two capabilities that complement Terminus's strengths in communication and community organization. Tomorrow, he'll lead a diplomatic mission to formalize their alliance and establish regular trading schedules. "Never thought I'd be a diplomat," Rick tells Gareth as they review the mission parameters. "Sheriff's deputy doesn't exactly train you for international relations." Gareth looks up from the stack of trade agreements and mutual aid pacts that have become his primary occupation. Good thing there's no playbook for rebuilding civilization. We're all making it up as we go. The door opens and Carol steps in, bringing the particular energy she's carried since arriving 3 weeks ago with a small group from Alabama. Rick still feels a surge of relief every time he sees her, the completion of something that had been missing since the prison fell. Carol had been following radio broadcasts from multiple communities, evaluating options before committing to any single settlement. Supply convoy from Oceanside is running 2 hours late, Carol reports, settling into a chair with the comfortable authority she's claimed as Terminus's inter-community security coordinator. Radio contact suggests mechanical problems, not hostile action, but I want to send a support team just in case. This is Carol as Rick has never seen her, not just surviving or protecting, but coordinating between multiple communities, thinking strategically about network security and mutual defense. Her experience with different survivor groups during her months alone has made her invaluable for understanding how various communities operate and what they need from each other. Daryl appears in the doorway, as if summoned by Carol's presence, their partnership resuming as naturally as if they'd never been separated. "Support team's ready," he says. "Me, Abraham, 2 folks from David's group who know the route. Should catch up with them within the hour." Rick watches their easy coordination and feels something settle in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tense. The reunion had been emotional but quiet. Carol and Daryl don't waste energy on dramatics when there's work to be done, but their partnership strengthens both of them in ways that benefit the entire network. Michonne enters carrying a thick folder marked with the seal she's designed for official Terminus documents, a simplified outline of railroad tracks converging at a central point, symbolizing the gathering of scattered people into community. "Draft of the Terminus Accords is ready for review," she says, spreading the documents across the table. Rick scans the carefully written pages, agreements that establish principles for cooperation between allied communities, mutual defense obligations, trade standardization, conflict resolution procedures, shared resource management during crises. It's the closest thing to a constitution that any group of survivor communities has attempted. "Think other settlements will actually follow this?" Carol asks, reading over Rick's shoulder. "Hilltop's leadership team has already reviewed the preliminary draft," Michonne says. "They want to propose some modifications, but they're committed to the general framework. Oceanside and the Savannah Group have indicated strong interest. It's ambitious in a way that would have seemed impossible when they first arrived at Terminus. Not just individual communities surviving independently, but a network of settlements coordinating resources and responsibilities, sharing knowledge and capabilities across hundreds of miles of territory." Carl appears in the doorway, no longer the boy who arrived at Terminus 5 months ago, but a young man whose opinions carry weight in community discussions. "The youth exchange program is ready to launch," he announces. 5 kids from here going to spend a month at Hilltop learning metalworking, 3 of their teenagers coming here to study radio communications and community mediation. The youth exchange represents something unprecedented in the post-apocalypse world. Young people traveling between communities not as refugees or traders, but as students, building relationships and skills that will strengthen the network for decades to come. "Any concerns from the families?" Rick asks. The idea of sending children beyond Terminus's protected boundaries still makes his protective instincts nervous, even when he knows intellectually that the Alliance communities are safe. Carl shakes his head. "Everyone's excited. Kids see it as adventure. Parents recognize the educational value. Plus, it's only a month, and we'll have regular radio contact throughout." That afternoon, the community gathers for Glenn and Maggie's wedding ceremony, not because they weren't already committed to each other, but because they want to celebrate their partnership in a context of hope and permanence that the prison never allowed. Representatives from 4 allied communities have made the journey to Terminus for the occasion. Rick watches Maggie walk toward Glenn, wearing a dress that Mary spent weeks sewing from fabric traded with the textile specialists at the Savannah settlement. Glenn's suit came from the same trade network, along with rings that the hilltop metalworkers crafted from silver recovered from abandoned jewelry stores. It's not just a wedding. It's a demonstration of what the allied communities can accomplish when they work together. A celebration that required coordination between multiple settlements, trade relationships, and the luxury of planning for joy rather than just survival. Bob officiates the ceremony with the gentle authority he's brought to his role as Terminus's medical network coordinator. His responsibilities now extend far beyond the boundaries of their community, providing telemedicine consultation to settlements across the region and coordinating medical supply distribution based on need rather than just proximity. Glenn and Maggie represent something essential about what we're building here, Bob says to the gathered crowd. Not just individual survival, but the possibility of futures worth celebrating. Children who'll grow up in a world where communities support each other instead of competing for resources. As if summoned by his words, Maggie's hand moves unconsciously to her stomach, now visibly showing her pregnancy. The first baby to be born into the Alliance network, representing hope and continuity in ways that extend far beyond any single community. Sasha speaks next, describing the communication network she's helped establish between settlements. Every night at sunset, 12 communities check in with each other, she says, sharing news, coordinating supply needs, providing support for communities facing challenges. We're not just surviving separately anymore. We're building something together. The ceremony concludes with music. Actual music, performed by a small group that includes musicians from 3 different communities. It's been years since Rick heard live music played for the joy of it, rather than as distraction from fear or boredom. That evening, the wedding celebration continues with food contributed by multiple communities, stories shared between settlements, and planning sessions for expanding the Alliance network. Representatives from Oceanside describe their fishing and salt production capabilities. The hilltop delegates explain their agricultural techniques and metalworking innovations. Abraham stands before the mixed crowd, describing the Washington, D.C. mission that has evolved from desperate journey to systematic expedition. Instead of one small group hoping to find government survivors, we're planning a coordinated mission with support from every allied community, he says. Supply staging at multiple waypoints, communication relays, fallback positions if the primary objective proves impossible. Eugene nods enthusiastically, his technical expertise now serving the entire network rather than just one community. Distributed mission architecture significantly improves success probability while reducing individual risk exposure. We're not betting everything on one attempt. We're building infrastructure that serves multiple objectives simultaneously. The Washington mission represents the Alliance Network's first major collaborative project, something too ambitious for any single community to attempt, but achievable, when 12 settlements coordinate their resources and capabilities. Later that evening, Rick finds himself on the expanded perimeter with Carol and Daryl, discussing security challenges that scale beyond individual community defense. The Alliance Network creates new vulnerabilities, trade routes to protect, communication systems to secure, coordination between settlements that could be disrupted by hostile groups. Heard rumors about a group calling themselves the Whisperers, Carol says, her voice carrying the particular tension she reserves for genuine threats. Communities west of here have reported strange encounters. People who dress like walkers, move with herds, seem to coordinate attacks. It's the kind of evolved threat that Rick knows was inevitable. Hostile groups that have adapted to the post-apocalypse world with strategies beyond simple raiding and intimidation. The Alliance Network's success makes them a larger target for anyone who believes that cooperation is weakness. We'll need to address this at the next Inter-Community Council meeting, Darrell says. Share intelligence, coordinate defensive strategies. Can't let one group pick off communities individually. As they complete their patrol circuit, Rick thinks about the transformation of his role over these past months. From desperate refugee to community member to diplomatic representative to network coordinator. Each expansion of responsibility has required new skills, new ways of thinking about leadership and cooperation. The celebration continues in the main courtyard, where representatives from 12 communities share food and stories and plans for the future. Children from multiple settlements play together, while adults discuss trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. 4 months ago, Rick was following painted signs toward an uncertain sanctuary, hoping for safety and expecting betrayal. Tonight, he's part of a network that spans 3 states, coordinator of diplomatic missions that forge alliances between communities that individually seemed impossible but collectively feel inevitable. Abraham finds Rick near the communications building, where Sasha is coordinating the nightly check-ins with allied settlements. "You know what's remarkable?" Abraham says, watching the evening reports come in from communities across the region. "We're not just rebuilding what existed before, we're building something better." Rick nods, listening to voices crackling over the radio from settlements dozens of miles away. Farmers sharing weather reports, craftspeople announcing new products available for trade, medical coordinators discussing resource distribution, security teams sharing intelligence about potential threats. "Think it can last?" Rick asks. Abraham considers this while watching Carl help organize sleeping arrangements for visiting delegates, while Glenn and Maggie accept congratulations from representatives of communities they've never seen but consider allies, while Carol and Darrell coordinate security measures that protect not just Terminus, but an entire network of allied settlements. "Don't know if it can last," Abraham says finally, "but it's worth building anyway. Even if it doesn't last forever, it'll last long enough to matter, long enough to prove it's possible." Rick goes to sleep that night, listening to the sounds of 12 communities settling into evening routines, coordinated by radio checks and mutual support agreements, protected by shared security measures and common principles. Tomorrow he'll lead a diplomatic mission to expand the alliance, strengthen the trade networks, and continue the work of rebuilding civilization one relationship at a time. For the first time since becoming a leader, Rick Grimes falls asleep, knowing that the success of what they've built doesn't depend on any single community surviving or any individual leader making perfect decisions. They've created something larger and more resilient than the sum of its parts, a network that can adapt, grow, and endure even if individual pieces fail. Outside his window, the radio antenna broadcasts their message into the Georgia darkness, reaching communities hundreds of miles away. Terminus Alliance Network, sanctuary for all, community for all. Together we survive. The painted sign still hangs at the main gate. Sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive, survive. But now it's one of dozens of signs in multiple languages, welcoming visitors to what has become the hub of a 13-community alliance network. Rick touches the original yellow letters, faded now from weather and age, and remembers the suspicious man who traced these same words a year ago today. Exactly 365 days since he walked through these gates, expecting betrayal, and finding something he didn't have words for then. Now, standing in a courtyard that bustles with the controlled chaos of a small city, Rick struggles to reconcile the fearful refugee he was with the diplomatic coordinator he's become. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," Michonne says, joining him at the gate. She carries herself differently now, still alert, still capable of violence, but with the relaxed confidence of someone whose expertise is valued rather than just tolerated. "Feels like a lifetime." "Feels like yesterday," Rick counters, watching Carl demonstrate communication equipment to a group of teenagers from 3 different allied communities. "Sometimes I look around and think we dreamed all of this." The anniversary celebration has drawn representatives from every community in the Alliance network, turning Terminus into a temporary festival ground. The main courtyard hosts demonstrations of crafts and technologies developed across the various settlements. The workshop areas buzz with collaborative projects between metalworkers, engineers, and farmers, sharing techniques that none of them could have developed in isolation. Bob emerges from the medical building with a young woman wearing the formal robes of a graduated medic, one of 12 students who completed the first class of his intercommunity medical college. The program trains healthcare providers for the entire Alliance network, combining traditional medical knowledge with the practical skills needed for post-apocalypse healthcare. Dr. Martinez will be returning to Oceanside to establish their first formal medical clinic, Bob announces to the small crowd gathered near the medical building. She's trained in both emergency trauma care and preventive medicine, equipped with supplies and knowledge to serve a community of 300 people. The applause is genuine and warm, recognition of both individual achievement and collective progress. Dr. Martinez represents something unprecedented in their world, a young person who chose to become a healer rather than a warrior, who learned skills for building rather than destroying. Abraham appears from the direction of the communications building, carrying himself with the satisfied air of someone whose ambitious plans have proven achievable. The Washington, D.C. mission returned 3 months ago, successful beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. Not just contact with government survivors, but establishment of formal diplomatic relations between the Alliance network and the emerging federal restoration effort. "Status report from the Capitol," Abraham announces, addressing the gathered community leaders. "Senate has formally recognized the Terminus Alliance as a provisional regional government. We're eligible for federal infrastructure support, medical supplies, and technical assistance." It's validation that would have seemed impossible when Rick first arrived, recognition that what they've built here represents legitimate governance rather than just successful survival. The federal restoration is still fragile, still limited to the eastern seaboard, but it's real enough to matter. Carl approaches the gathering with the easy confidence of someone who's never known himself as anything but valuable to his community. At 17, he serves as cultural liaison between communities, helping integrate different groups' traditions and knowledge into alliance-wide practices. His childhood of constant danger has transformed into adolescence of constant purpose. Youth Council has approved the Inter-Community Arts Festival proposal, Carl reports. 6 communities have committed to sending musicians, artists, and storytellers. We're planning the first Alliance-wide cultural celebration for next spring. Rick watches his son coordinate with adults 3 times his age, offering opinions that are received as expertise rather than precocious suggestions. Carl has grown up during Terminus's expansion, his formative experiences shaped more by community building than survival desperation. The afternoon includes formal presentations from each allied community, sharing innovations and challenges from the past year. Hilltop describes new agricultural techniques that increased crop yields by 40%. Oceanside reports successful coastal trading relationships with communities as far away as Florida. The Savannah settlement has developed textile production capabilities that serve the entire Alliance network. Darryl takes the stage to describe the security coordination that protects trade routes and communication networks across hundreds of miles of territory. His presentation is methodical and comprehensive, covering threat assessment, rapid response protocols, and inter-community training programs. The man who once trusted no one beyond his immediate family now coordinates protection for thousands of people across multiple states. Had 3 major hostile group encounters this year, Darryl reports. Whisperers tested our northern perimeter. Raiders from Alabama tried to disrupt the Hilltop trade route, and we tracked a slaver operation through South Carolina. All 3 threats neutralized through coordinated alliance response. Carol joins him on the improvised stage, describing the intelligence networks that provide early warning of potential threats. Her months traveling between communities before settling at Terminus made her invaluable for understanding how hostile groups operate and how allied communities can share information to stay ahead of developing problems. Network security depends on every community understanding they're not just protecting themselves, Carol explains. When Oceanside spots suspicious activity off the coast, that information helps Hilltop prepare their inland defenses. When we track movement through Georgia, that helps our Tennessee allies adjust their patrol schedules. Evening brings the celebration's centerpiece, a formal dinner that includes representatives from every allied community, sharing food that required coordination between multiple settlements to produce. The menu represents the Alliance's collective capabilities: seafood from Oceanside, grain products from Hilltop, preserved fruits from the mountain communities, and beverages from settlements that specialize in fermentation and brewing. Glenn stands to address the gathering, but his words are interrupted by Maggie calling out from the residential building. "Glenn! It's time!" The dinner crowd freezes for a moment, before understanding dawns. Maggie's pregnancy, carefully monitored by Bob's medical team and supported by resources from across the Alliance, has reached its conclusion. The first baby to be born into the Alliance network is arriving on the anniversary of Rick's group's arrival at Terminus. The next few hours blur together in the organized chaos that surrounds birth in a community that treats new life as collective blessing rather than individual responsibility. Bob coordinates with Dr. Martinez and 2 other medics who arrived for the anniversary celebration. Mary organizes supplies and assistance with the practiced efficiency she brings to feeding large groups. Rick finds himself pacing the corridor outside the medical building with most of the anniversary celebration guests, all of them instinctively understanding that this birth represents something larger than one family's happiness. This child will grow up in a world where community alliance is normal, where cooperation between settlements is expected, where the apocalypse is history rather than daily reality. Abraham emerges from the medical building with tears in his eyes and a grin that threatens to split his face in half. "Healthy baby girl," he announces to the waiting crowd. "Glenn and Maggie want everyone to meet Herschel Rhee." The name hits Rick like a physical blow. Herschel, after Maggie's father, the man whose farm represented their first taste of sustained safety, whose death marked the beginning of the prison's end. It's a choice that honors the past while celebrating the future, acknowledging loss while embracing hope. One by one, the celebration guests file past the medical building window to catch a glimpse of the baby who represents everything they've worked to build. Born into safety, surrounded by allies, growing up in a world where communities support each other rather than compete for scarce resources. Carl holds his honorary niece with the gentle competence of someone who's helped care for multiple children during Terminus's growth. "She's going to grow up thinking this is normal," he says, wonderingly. "Safe communities, allied settlements, people working together instead of fighting over everything." Michonne nods, her expression soft, with something that might be maternal instinct or might just be profound relief that children can be born into hope rather than desperation. That's the point, the whole point of everything we've built. As the evening winds toward midnight, Rick finds himself back at the original painted sign, now joined by Eugene, who carries a folder thick with development plans and infrastructure projections. The Alliance network continues to grow, with 3 more communities expressing interest in formal membership and preliminary contact established with survivor settlements as far away as Texas and California. Statistical analysis suggests we're approaching sustainable growth equilibrium, Eugene reports with characteristic precision. Population growth balanced by resource expansion, security challenges managed through coordinated response, technological development shared across the entire network. Think it can last? Rick asks, echoing Abraham's question from months ago. Eugene adjusts his glasses, considering the question with the thoroughness he brings to all analytical problems. Historical precedents suggest that successful governance structures adapt rather than simply endure. What we've built here will change, evolve, face challenges we haven't anticipated, but the fundamental principles, cooperation over competition, shared prosperity over individual accumulation, those have proven remarkably resilient. Later that night, Rick walks the expanded perimeter one final time, listening to the sounds of 13 communities settling into sleep across hundreds of miles of territory. Radio chatter carries status reports, friendly conversations, and coordination for tomorrow's activities. Children's laughter echoes from residential buildings that house families from 6 different communities. A year ago, Rick Grimes followed painted signs toward an uncertain destination, carrying nothing but weapons and suspicion, and the desperate hope that his family might somehow survive. Tonight, he goes to sleep in a room with windows that open to courtyards where children play safely, in a community that serves as governmental hub for 13 allied settlements, in a network that spans 3 states and continues growing. His son has grown up in peace rather than violence. His friends have found purposes beyond mere survival. The people he thought he'd lost forever have returned to share in building something unprecedented. And tonight, for the first time since the world ended, a baby has been born into a civilization that exists rather than one that's trying to be rebuilt. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to expand the Alliance and strengthen the relationships that make all of this possible. But tonight, Rick Grimes falls asleep, listening to the sound of his granddaughter breathing easily in a world that learned to be safe enough for children to grow up dreaming of futures beyond survival. 1 year after arriving at Terminus, expecting betrayal and finding sanctuary, Rick goes to sleep, knowing that they've built something that will outlast all of them. Not just communities that can survive, but a network that can thrive, adapt, and endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The painted sign at the gate still promises sanctuary for all who arrive, but now it's backed by the resources and relationships of 13 allied communities, protected by coordinated security networks, and sustained by the cooperative principles that turned desperate refugees into architects of restored civilization. Outside his window, the radio antenna broadcasts into the night. Terminus Alliance Network. 1 year strong. Sanctuary for all. Community for all. Together we survive. Together we thrive. 3-month-old Herschel Rhee sleeps peacefully in the crib that Abraham built from salvaged oak, her tiny fingers curled around a stuffed rabbit that Mary sewed from fabric traded with the textile cooperative in Savannah. She has never heard the moan of walkers, never felt hunger that couldn't be satisfied, never known fear that safety might disappear without warning. Rick watches his granddaughter sleep and wrestles with questions that would have seemed absurd 18 months ago. How do you prepare a child for danger without destroying their sense of security? How much truth do you tell someone who's only known peace about the world that exists beyond the Alliance Network's borders? Carl enters the nursery with the quiet competence of someone who's helped care for dozens of children during Terminus's expansion, but his approach to baby Herschel carries the particular tenderness of family connection. At 18, Carl has become the community's primary educator for survival skills, teaching children basic self-defense and awareness techniques through games and exercises that feel like play rather than preparation for violence. Teaching knife safety to the kindergarten group today, Carl tells Rick, adjusting Herschel's blanket with practiced care. Not knife fighting, knife safety. How to handle tools without hurting yourself or others. Same way you'd teach any kid in any normal world. But that's the question that keeps Rick awake some nights. Is this a normal world? Within the Alliance Network, violence is rare, resources are managed cooperatively, children attend schools rather than guard shifts. But beyond the network's borders, the wasteland continues, populated by hostile groups, roving walkers, and communities that have chosen violence over cooperation. Michonne appears in the doorway, carrying a stack of lesson plans for the expanded education system she's developing. The children of Terminus now attend formal classes in literacy, mathematics, science, and what she calls civic responsibility, the principles of cooperative governance and community decision-making that maintain the Alliance Network. Parents' Council meeting this afternoon, Michonne reports. We need to address the question about field trips beyond Alliance territory. Some families want their children to see the wider world, understand what exists outside our borders. Others think any exposure to external dangers is unnecessarily risky. It's a debate that cuts to the heart of their educational philosophy. Do children raised in safety need to understand danger to appreciate security? Or does exposing them to external threats undermine the very peace they've worked so hard to create? The discussion becomes more urgent with the arrival of a transport vehicle from the southern patrol route. Carol and Daryl emerge from the driver's seats, but they're not alone. 4 children between the ages of 8 and 14 climb out of the back, carrying the particular wariness of kids who've survived on their own after losing their families. Rick recognizes the expression in their eyes. Hypervigilance, masked by practiced compliance. The look of children who've learned to assess every new situation as potentially life-threatening. It's an expression he remembers from Carl's face during their worst days, and seeing it again reminds him why they've worked so hard to build something better. Bob approaches the group with the gentle authority he brings to all medical assessments, but his evaluation goes beyond physical health. These children have been living rough for weeks, surviving through skills that no child should need to develop. They're malnourished, exhausted, and carrying trauma that will take months or years of safety to heal. Their parents' community was overrun by a group calling themselves the Saviors. Carol explains quietly to Rick, while Daryl helps the children settle into temporary housing. Kids escaped into the woods, been taking care of each other ever since. Oldest one, Sarah, she's been making all the survival decisions for the group. Sarah stands apart from the other children, shoulders squared and eyes constantly moving, assessing exits and potential threats with the automatic vigilance of someone who's had to keep others alive through her own alertness. She's 14, the same age Carl was when they arrived at the prison, carrying responsibilities that should belong to adults. The contrast between Sarah and the Terminus children is striking. The kids who've grown up in the Alliance Network approach the newcomers with curious friendliness, offering to share toys and show them around the community. They have no context for the kind of survival skills Sarah's group has developed, no understanding of why someone their age might flinch at sudden movements or insist on sleeping near exits. Abraham emerges from the technical school he's established in the expanded workshop complex, where teenagers from across the Alliance network learn everything from basic electronics to advanced engineering. The curriculum combines practical skills with theoretical knowledge, preparing young people to maintain and expand the technological infrastructure that supports their communities. Got some of the older kids working on radio relay construction, Abraham reports, teaching them how communication networks actually function, not just how to use them. Figure if they understand the underlying systems, they can adapt and improve them as they grow up. Eugene joins him, carrying blueprints for an ambitious project, a library and research center designed to preserve scientific and technical knowledge for future generations. The building will house not just books and documents, but workshop space for experimentation and development, ensuring that the next generation can build on their achievements rather than just maintaining them. Knowledge preservation is critical for long-term civilization sustainability, Eugene explains, spreading the blueprints on a nearby table. We're not just teaching children to use existing technology, we're providing them with the theoretical foundation to develop new technologies as challenges arise. The afternoon brings the Parents' Council meeting that Michonne mentioned, and Rick finds himself in the unusual position of being the voice of caution rather than action. The debate focuses on whether Alliance children should be exposed to the realities of the outside world through supervised expeditions beyond the network's borders. They need to understand what we've built here, argues Janet, who now has 2 young children of her own. They need to see the alternative to cooperation, understand why the principles we've taught them matter. David counters from his perspective as a parent who's lost one community already. They need to feel safe enough to be children. That's the whole point of what we've built, creating a world where kids can grow up without constant fear. Glenn speaks up, his voice carrying the weight of new parenthood. I want Herschel to understand the world her parents lived through, to appreciate what we've achieved here. But I also want her to take safety for granted in a way we never could. Maggie nods, bouncing baby Herschel gently while she speaks. Maybe the question isn't whether to expose them to danger, but how to teach them to value peace without making them helpless if that peace ever gets threatened. Carl raises his hand for attention, and Rick notices how naturally the adult council members turn to listen to his perspective. What if we're overthinking this? Carl suggests. The kids from outside, like Sarah's group, they have survival skills we can learn from. Our kids have security and education they can share. Maybe the answer is making sure both groups can teach each other. It's a characteristic Carl solution, finding the bridge between competing approaches, the synthesis that honors both perspectives rather than choosing between them. Rick watches his son propose integration strategies with the confidence of someone who's never known himself as anything but valuable to community decision-making. Darryl enters the meeting late, bringing the particular energy he gets when wrestling with emotional complications. His role as unofficial uncle to the community's children has evolved naturally from his protective instincts, but he struggles with the balance between preparing them for potential threats and allowing them to enjoy their childhood security. Been working with Sarah's group, Darryl reports, teaching them that it's okay to be kids here, that they don't have to stay alert all the time, but also learning from them. They know things our kids don't about reading people, spotting trouble before it develops. The conversation continues for hours, moving through philosophical questions and practical considerations. How much combat training is appropriate for children in a peaceful community? Should Alliance kids learn to kill walkers, or is that knowledge they shouldn't need? What happens when children raised in cooperation encounter communities that prioritize individual survival over collective welfare? Sasha joins the discussion late, bringing updates from the expanded communication network that now coordinates with allied settlements across 4 states. Been talking with other community leaders about this same question, she reports. Everyone's struggling with how to raise the second generation, kids who've only known stability. Bob speaks up with the particular insight that medical training brings to child development. Trauma isn't just about violence, he points out. Some of these kids are struggling because they don't know how to trust safety. Others are struggling because they've never developed the skills to handle uncertainty or stress. The meeting ends without definitive conclusions, but with agreement to develop a comprehensive approach that includes exposure to controlled challenges, education about the broader world, and integration between children from different backgrounds. It's a typically Alliance solution, collaborative, inclusive, and designed to adapt as they learn more. That evening, Rick finds Sarah sitting alone on the workshop steps, watching the other children play games that she doesn't understand. Her isolation isn't hostile. She's just processing a world where children can be loud without attracting danger, where running and laughing doesn't require constant awareness of exit routes. Takes time, Rick tells her, settling beside her on the steps. Learning to trust safety when you've had to stay alert for so long. Sarah looks at him with eyes that carry too much knowledge for her age. The little kids here, they don't know how lucky they are. They think this is normal. Maybe that's the point, Rick says. Maybe we built this so that safety could be normal for someone. But what happens when they face something dangerous? What happens when the safe world breaks? It's the question that keeps Rick awake, the responsibility that weights every decision about community defense and expansion planning. They've created a generation of children who take cooperation for granted, who expect communities to help each other, rather than compete for resources. Then they do what we did, Rick says finally. They adapt, they learn, they take care of each other. But maybe they do it with better tools, better knowledge about how communities can work together, better understanding of alternatives to violence. Carl approaches from the direction of the residential buildings, moving with the casual confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment. Sarah, want to see the radio workshop tomorrow? Abraham's teaching some of the older kids how to build transmission equipment. Sarah considers this, and Rick can see her wrestling with the unfamiliar concept of learning skills for building rather than surviving. Is it useful? Like, actually useful if something goes wrong? Everything here is useful, Carl says simply. We just get to choose what we build instead of only fixing what breaks. Later that evening, Rick walks the perimeter with Michonne, discussing the challenges of raising children who've known only peace in a world where peace is still fragile. The Alliance network continues to expand, but it also faces new threats, organized hostile groups, resource competition, and the fundamental question of how far to extend their principles into territories that haven't chosen cooperation. Think we're doing the right thing? Rick asks, trying to give them normal childhoods when normal is still so rare. Michonne pauses to wave at a group of children playing an elaborate game that seems to involve both strategy and collaboration, the kind of play that develops problem-solving skills while reinforcing cooperative values. I think we're doing the human thing, she says, trying to give the next generation something better than what we had. They complete their circuit and head back toward the residential areas, where the sounds of children settling into sleep create the background music of a community that has learned to trust tomorrow. Baby Herschel sleeps peacefully in her crib, protected by security networks and alliance agreements, surrounded by adults who've chosen to build something better rather than just survive something terrible. Tomorrow they'll continue the careful work of raising the second generation, children who'll grow up taking safety for granted while learning skills to protect that safety, kids who'll inherit a network of allied communities and the responsibility to expand and strengthen those relationships. Rick goes to sleep knowing that they've created something unprecedented, a generation that will know cooperation as normal, peace as expected, and community as the foundation rather than the exception. Whatever challenges the future brings, these children will face them with tools and knowledge and relationships that Rick's generation never had. Outside his window, the night sounds include children's dreams rather than sentries' alerts, lullabies rather than warnings, the gentle breathing of a generation that's learning to expect tomorrow rather than just hope for it. The radio crackles to life at dawn with a signal that changes everything. Clear, strong transmission from a coordinated network of communities spanning from Texas to California. Eugene adjusts the frequency controls with the careful precision he brings to all technical work, but his hands shake slightly as he fine-tunes the connection that represents something unprecedented. Proof that the Alliance network model has succeeded across multiple regions. "This is the Pacific Coast Alliance calling all Eastern networks," the voice says, professional and organized in a way that speaks to established infrastructure rather than desperate survivors. "We're coordinating a continental rebuilding summit, requesting response from any organized governmental or quasi-governmental entities." Rick stands in the communications building at 5 in the morning, listening to evidence that their small experiment in cooperative survival has grown into something approaching actual civilization. The transmission includes status reports from 43 allied communities across 6 states, coordination protocols for resource sharing that span time zones, and formal diplomatic requests for establishing inter-regional cooperation. Abraham enters carrying coffee and the particular alertness he gets when major opportunities require immediate planning. His Washington, D.C. missions have established formal relations with federal restoration efforts, but this transmission suggests something larger: coordinated governance spanning continental distances rather than just regional alliances. "Got confirmation from 3 other major networks," Abraham reports, spreading maps across the communications table. "Great Lakes Alliance, Southwest Coalition, and something called the New England Compact. They're all reporting similar development patterns, individual communities forming alliances, alliances forming regional networks seeking coordination with each other. The implications overwhelm Rick's ability to process them quickly. 2 years ago, he was following painted signs toward uncertain sanctuary. Now they're being invited to participate in what sounds like continental government restoration, the rebuilding of civilization on a scale that seemed impossible when individual survival required all their energy. Carl appears in the doorway, no longer the teenager who arrived at Terminus, but a young man whose opinions carry weight in community decision-making. At 19, he serves as cultural liaison between alliance communities, but his interests extend beyond regional coordination toward the broader questions of national rebuilding. "Been monitoring transmissions all night," Carl reports, his voice carrying excitement that Rick recognizes as dangerous. "They're talking about establishing transcontinental trade routes, coordinated research programs, standardized communication protocols, real government, not just community cooperation." Rick hears the yearning in his son's voice, the desire to be part of something larger than even their remarkable alliance network, to contribute to rebuilding on a scale that matches the scope of what was lost. But he also hears the implicit question, whether staying focused on regional success represents settling for less than they could achieve. Michonne enters with the particular energy she brings to complex strategic problems, carrying folders that suggest she's been working on this since the first transmissions arrived. Her role in developing the Terminus Accords has prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge, translating alliance principles into frameworks that could apply to national governance. "I've been drafting a proposal," Michonne announces, spreading documents across the table. "A constitutional convention framework based on the alliance principles we've proven work. Not trying to restore the old federal system, but building something new based on what we've learned about cooperation under crisis conditions." The documents are ambitious in scope and detail, frameworks for democratic representation across vast distances, resource allocation systems that balance local autonomy with collective responsibility, conflict resolution mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of zero-sum competition that destroys communities. "Think it could work?" Rick asks, studying the carefully written proposals that represent years of alliance experience translated into national policy frameworks. "Works here," Michonne says simply. "Works across 13 communities, spanning 3 states. Question is whether the principles scale up to continental distances and populations in the millions instead of thousands." Darrell enters the communications building with the reluctant attention he gives to discussions that might require leaving the security they've built. His investment in Terminus runs deeper than professional responsibility. This is home in a way that nowhere else has been since before the world ended. "You're talking about abandoning everything we've built to chase some fantasy about national government?" Darrell asks, his voice carrying the particular wariness he reserves for plans that sound too good to be true. "Not abandoning," Rick says carefully, "contributing. The question is whether our success here obligates us to help others achieve similar success elsewhere. It's the moral complexity that keeps Rick awake since the transmissions started. Whether communities that have achieved stability have responsibilities to communities still struggling with basic survival. The Alliance network succeeded partly because they focused resources and energy on regional cooperation rather than dispersing efforts across impossible distances. Glenn and Maggie arrive carrying 1-year-old Herschel, who babbles contentedly in the arms of parents who've never had to worry about her safety or future security. Their presence adds emotional weight to every discussion about risk and change, decisions that affect not just adults who chose this life, but children who deserve the security their parents have created. "What are we actually talking about?" Maggie asks, settling Herschel on her lap while studying the maps and proposals scattered across the table. "Sending representatives to some convention? Relocating leadership to participate in national governance? Risking what we've built for something that might not work?" Glenn nods, his engineering background making him focus on practical implementation rather than ambitious possibilities. The Alliance network took 2 years to build and prove stable. National government would be exponentially more complex, with exponentially more potential failure points. Bob appears in the doorway, with the gentle authority he brings to community health questions, but his perspective extends beyond medical concerns toward the broader question of community well-being. His medical college now trains healthcare providers for dozens of allied communities, representing investment in skills and relationships that can't easily be relocated or replicated. "Got 43 students currently enrolled in medical training programs," Bob reports. "Another 67 applicants waiting for next semester. We're not just serving our own communities anymore. We're providing essential services to regions that can't develop these capabilities independently." The weight of responsibility settles over the room like morning fog. They've succeeded so thoroughly that other communities depend on their continued operation, their continued focus on regional needs rather than national ambitions. Walking away to chase continental governance might abandon people who rely on what they've built here. Sasha joins the discussion, carrying communication logs that show the scope of their current operations. Daily coordination with allied communities across 4 states, resource allocation decisions that affect thousands of people, conflict resolution mediation between settlements that might return to violence without neutral third-party intervention. Processed 47 inter-community disputes this month, Sasha reports. Everything from trade disagreements to boundary conflicts to resource allocation questions. Most communities don't have the experience or neutral standing to mediate these problems themselves. The morning grows later, as their discussion expands to include community representatives from across the Alliance network, brought in via radio conference to discuss the implications of national rebuilding invitations. Each community faces similar questions about local focus versus national contribution, but their answers reveal different priorities and capabilities. Hilltop emphasizes agricultural specialization that serves regional food security. Oceanside describes coastal trade relationships that depend on sustained local investment. The mountain communities explain resource extraction operations that require continuous management. Each community has developed specialized capabilities that support Alliance success, but might not transfer to national governance roles. By afternoon, the discussion has moved to the main meeting hall, where Terminus residents and Alliance representatives participate in the most consequential decision the network has faced since its formation. The question isn't just whether to participate in national rebuilding, but how to balance local responsibilities with broader obligations. Carl speaks first, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who's grown up in successful community governance. We've proven that cooperation works, that communities can solve problems through alliance rather than competition. Don't we have an obligation to share that knowledge with communities still struggling with basic survival? Gareth responds with the careful perspective of someone who's managed Terminus since its founding, who understands both the potential and the fragility of what they've achieved. We have obligations to the communities that depend on us now. National rebuilding is important, but not if it means abandoning people who rely on our continued success. The debate continues for hours, moving through moral philosophy and practical logistics, individual ambitions and collective responsibilities. Representatives participate via radio from allied communities across the region, sharing perspectives on how national involvement might affect their local operations and relationships. Abraham argues for systematic participation. National coordination enhances rather than threatens regional success. Shared resources, coordinated research, mutual defense against threats too large for individual alliances to handle. Carroll counters with security concerns. Unknown leadership, untested systems, potential for conflict between regional and national priorities. We know our alliance works. National government is pure speculation. Eugene offers technical perspective. Communication infrastructure exists to support continental coordination. Resource allocation algorithms scale effectively across large populations. The technical challenges are manageable if the political will exists. By evening, they've reached a compromise that honors both local obligations and national opportunities. Terminus will remain as the hub of regional alliance operations while contributing specific expertise to national rebuilding efforts. Instead of relocating leadership or abandoning regional focus, they'll establish specialized teams to participate in continental coordination while maintaining their proven local systems. Rick finds himself designated as primary representative to the Constitutional Convention Michonne proposed, carrying alliance experience into national discussions while maintaining his role in regional governance. It's a solution that allows contribution without abandonment, national participation without local neglect. Carl volunteers to coordinate youth involvement in interregional cultural exchange, building relationships between young people who will inherit whatever national systems emerge from current rebuilding efforts. His role represents investment in long-term success rather than just immediate coordination. Michonne accepts responsibility for translating alliance governance principles into national policy frameworks, contributing their proven experience with cooperative decision-making to continental discussions about democratic representation and resource allocation. That evening, Rick stands on Terminus's expanded walls, looking out at territory that houses 17 allied communities and supports coordination between dozens of others across multiple states. The radio antenna broadcasts their nightly message, Terminus Alliance Network, 2 years strong, sanctuary for all, community for all. Together we thrive. But tonight, the message carries additional meaning, evidence that the principles they've proven locally can contribute to rebuilding civilization on continental scales, that local success creates both opportunity and obligation to help others achieve similar stability. 2 years ago, Rick followed painted signs toward uncertain sanctuary, hoping for safety and expecting betrayal. Tomorrow he'll participate in discussions about continental governance, representing alliance principles, in conversations about national rebuilding, contributing local experience to challenges that span time zones and include populations in the millions. The painted sign at Terminus's gate still promises sanctuary for all who arrive, but now that promise extends beyond regional borders toward the possibility of national restoration, continental cooperation, and the rebuilding of civilization based on principles of mutual aid rather than individual competition. Outside his window, baby Herschel sleeps peacefully in a world where community alliance is normal, where cooperation between settlements is expected, where the next generation will inherit not just local security, but the possibility of national stability. Tomorrow will bring new challenges on unprecedented scales. But tonight, Rick goes to sleep, knowing they've built something resilient enough to contribute to civilization's restoration while maintaining the local relationships that make that contribution meaningful. The wider world calls, and Terminus Alliance Network is ready to answer, not by abandoning what they've built, but by sharing it with others who are still building towards similar success. 5-year-old Herschel Rhee runs through the courtyard with the careless confidence of someone who has never known danger, chasing her 2-year-old brother Glenn Jr., while their parents watch from the shade of fruit trees that nobody planted for defense. The children's laughter echoes off buildings designed for education rather than fortification, past workshops where teenagers learn engineering instead of weapon maintenance, through gardens planned for beauty as well as nutrition. Rick watches his grandchildren play and struggles to reconcile this scene with his memories of the desperate man who traced painted words on a rusted sign 5 years ago. The Terminus courtyard now spans 3 times its original size, home to nearly 400 residents, and serving as governmental hub for an alliance network that coordinates 47 communities across 6 states. The painted sign still hangs at the original gate, sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive survive. But it's surrounded by monuments to growth and success. A bronze plaque commemorating the Continental Accords that established interregional cooperation. A memorial garden honoring communities that didn't survive to join the alliance. A children's playground where the next generation learns cooperation through games their parents could never have imagined playing. Carl approaches from the direction of the newly completed Alliance University, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone whose opinions shape policy across multiple time zones. At 23, he serves as cultural coordinator for the Atlantic Regional Government, bridging the gap between communities that remember the apocalypse and those young enough to take cooperation for granted. Continental Assembly approved the infrastructure funding proposal, Carl reports, settling beside Rick on the bench they built together 3 years ago. Transcontinental Communication Network will be operational by next spring. Real-time coordination between Pacific and Atlantic alliances, shared resource management, coordinated response to any threats too large for individual regions. Rick nods, processing information that would have seemed like fantasy when they first arrived at Terminus. The Continental Assembly represents democratic governance spanning from California to Maine, based on alliance principles proven successful in smaller communities and scaled up through careful experimentation and gradual expansion. Michonne emerges from the federal courthouse, the first federal building constructed since the restoration began, designed according to architectural principles that emphasize transparency and accessibility rather than intimidation and exclusion. Her role as Chief Justice of the Atlantic Regional Court has evolved into something approaching national legal leadership, developing precedents that balance local autonomy with collective responsibility. Marriage licensing system is fully operational, Michonne reports, with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical frameworks have proven practical success. Couples can marry in one alliance community and have their union recognized across the entire continental network. Property rights, parental responsibilities, inheritance laws, all standardized while respecting local cultural variations. It's the kind of bureaucratic achievement that represents civilization's return more than any dramatic rescue or victory. People can plan futures that span multiple communities, raise children with confidence in legal protections, build wealth that will transfer to the next generation according to predictable rules rather than might-makes-right survival dynamics. Daryl appears from the direction of the training facilities, where he teaches advanced security techniques to young people from across the Alliance network. His students come to learn not just combat skills, but the more complex art of maintaining peace through strength rather than intimidation, protection without paranoia. Graduate class is ready for deployment, Daryl announces, gesturing toward a group of young adults who carry themselves with confidence that comes from competence rather than aggression. 12 new peace officers trained in de-escalation, conflict mediation, and coordinated response protocols. They'll be working with communities still transitioning from survival-based governance to alliance principles. The peace officers represent something unprecedented. Law enforcement trained specifically for communities learning to trust cooperation over competition, skilled in building rather than merely maintaining order. They carry weapons but emphasize negotiation, trained to protect the vulnerable while helping potential threats find alternatives to violence. Glenn and Maggie approach with their 3 children, Herschel, Glenn Jr. and baby Beth, born just 6 months ago, into a world where newborn survival rates match pre-apocalypse standards, thanks to Bob's medical network and alliance-wide resource coordination. Their family represents the ultimate success of what they built here, people who plan for multiple children because they can assume safety, education, and community support. Housing Expansion Committee approved the university dormitory project, Glenn reports, his engineering background still contributing to infrastructure development even as his primary focus has shifted to family life. Students from every Alliance community can attend advanced education programs without economic barriers. Full scholarship system funded through inter-community resource sharing. Maggie adds, adjusting baby Beth's position for comfortable nursing. Cultural exchange program enrolled 200 students this semester. Kids from fishing communities, learning agriculture, mountain communities, children studying coastal engineering, urban specialists training in rural resource management. The university represents investment in future leadership, ensuring that young people develop expertise that serves the entire alliance rather than just individual communities. Students graduate with technical skills and cultural understanding that makes inter-community cooperation natural rather than negotiated. Abraham emerges from the communications complex, carrying reports from the morning's Continental Coordination meeting. His role has evolved from military logistics to infrastructure coordination, managing resource flows and information networks that span distances the original Terminus founders never imagined reaching. Pacific Alliance reports successful integration with the Great Lakes Confederation, Abraham announces. Continental Resource Sharing Agreement is fully operational. Drought relief from the northern regions, technical expertise flowing west, cultural exchange programs connecting communities from Oregon to Florida. Eugene joins him, carrying the satisfied expression of someone whose technical expertise has proven essential to civilization's restoration. His communication networks now coordinate everything from weather reporting to medical research, educational resource sharing, to trade route management across continental distances. Statistical analysis confirms sustainable growth patterns across all Alliance regions, Eugene reports with characteristic precision. Population growth balanced by resource expansion, technological development shared efficiently, conflict resolution mechanisms preventing zero-sum competition between communities. Bob appears from the medical college, which has expanded to include research facilities and training programs that serve communities across multiple continents. His medical network has achieved something approaching public health system restoration, with preventive care and emergency response capabilities that rival pre-apocalypse standards. Disease eradication program exceeded all projections, Bob reports, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of medical achievement. Haven't seen a case of preventable, infection-related death in the Alliance network for 18 months. Life expectancy in Alliance communities now matches national averages from before the collapse. Sasha joins the gathering, carrying communication logs that represent the daily coordination required to maintain continental cooperation. Her networks now facilitate everything from resource allocation to cultural exchange, crisis response to routine administrative coordination between communities separated by thousands of miles. Daily check-ins from 217 allied communities, Sasha reports. Morning coordination for trade routes, afternoon status updates for security and medical needs, evening cultural programs connecting young people across time zones. As the afternoon grows later, representatives from across the Alliance network arrive for the monthly Continental Coordination meeting. But today's agenda includes something special, a celebration of the 5th anniversary of what Alliance historians now call the Terminus model, the proof that cooperation could succeed even under extreme stress. Carol appears from the Archives building, carrying historical documents that record the transformation from desperate survival to continental governance. Her role has evolved into something approaching national historian, documenting lessons learned and principles proven for future generations who might face different but equally challenging circumstances. Historical analysis confirms the decision-making patterns that enabled success, Carol reports, spreading documents that show progression from individual communities to regional alliances to continental cooperation. Trust building through small commitments, resource sharing before formal agreements, conflict resolution through mediation rather than force. That evening brings the celebration's centerpiece, a gathering that includes not just alliance representatives, but children and grandchildren who represent the generation that will inherit what they've built. The main courtyard hosts families from dozens of communities, sharing food that required coordination between multiple regions to produce. Rick finds himself seated at the center table, not because of rank or authority, but because tonight is about remembering the journey that brought them here. Around him sit the people who walked through Terminus's gates 5 years ago, carrying nothing but weapons and suspicion and desperate hope. Carl stands to address the gathering, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who's grown up watching cooperation succeed. 5 years ago, 12 desperate people arrived at a community that promised sanctuary for all who arrive. Tonight, those 12 people have helped build a continental alliance that includes over 2 million residents across 47 member communities. The applause is warm and genuine, recognition of achievement that seemed impossible when survival took all their energy. But Rick notices something more significant than the numbers, the quality of the applause coming from people who clap because they're happy rather than because they're grateful to still be alive. Michonne speaks next, describing the legal frameworks that enable continental cooperation while protecting local autonomy. We've proven that democracy can work even under extreme stress, that people will choose cooperation over competition when they understand the benefits of mutual aid rather than zero-sum resource struggles. Daryl's contribution is characteristically brief but profound. Ain't about not being ready for trouble, about building something worth protecting, something that makes the trouble worth handling. Glenn and Maggie speak together, representing the family stability that their success has made possible. Our children will grow up assuming safety, expecting cooperation, taking for granted that communities help each other solve problems. They'll inherit not just security, but the tools and knowledge to maintain and expand what we've built together. Abraham describes the infrastructure that enables continental coordination, communication networks, transportation systems, resource allocation mechanisms that function reliably across vast distances and diverse communities. Eugene contributes technical perspective. Distributed governance systems provide redundancy and resilience. Continental coordination enhances rather than threatens local autonomy. Network effects multiply individual community capabilities beyond what any single settlement could achieve independently. Bob speaks about health and education achievements, the elimination of preventable disease, the establishment of educational systems that serve communities regardless of economic capacity, the medical networks that ensure healthcare access for Alliance residents from Georgia to California. Sasha describes the communication systems that make continental cooperation possible. Daily coordination between communities separated by thousands of miles, real-time resource sharing, cultural exchange programs that build relationships across regional differences. As the celebration continues into the evening, Rick finds himself surrounded by children who listen to stories about the early days with the fascination that previous generations reserved for fairy tales. They ask questions about walkers and raiders, prison communities, and desperate journeys, with the innocent curiosity of people for whom such dangers are historical rather than personal. "Tell us about the painted signs, Grandpa Rick," Herschel asks, settling onto his lap with the comfortable assumption of safety that still amazes him. Rick describes following railroad tracks toward uncertain sanctuary, reading promises painted by strangers, arriving at Terminus expecting betrayal and finding something he didn't have words for then. He talks about learning to trust Gareth's leadership, building alliance relationships, discovering that cooperation could succeed even when competition seemed safer. "Why did you decide to trust the painted signs?" Glenn Jr. asks, his 4-year-old mind trying to understand decisions made under circumstances he's never experienced. "Because the alternative was giving up hope," Rick says simply. and hope turned out to be the most practical choice we could have made. Carl adds his perspective as someone who bridged the gap between apocalypse survival and alliance governance. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume that everyone's dangerous. Sometimes trust is the strongest defense you can choose. As the evening winds toward midnight, Rick walks the expanded perimeter one final time, accompanied by grandchildren who ask questions about the original walls, the watchtowers that no longer need constant manning, the defensive preparations that proved unnecessary because diplomacy succeeded where force might have failed. The Alliance network now includes communities from coast to coast, governed by democratic principles proven successful at local levels and scaled up through careful experimentation. Trade routes connect fishing villages with mountain mining operations, agricultural communities with urban manufacturing centers, research universities with practical training facilities. 5 years ago, Rick Grimes followed painted signs toward uncertain sanctuary, carrying nothing but weapons and suspicion and the desperate hope that his family might somehow survive. Tonight, he goes to sleep in a world where his grandchildren attend universities that teach inter-community cooperation as a normal subject, where conflict resolution is a standard part of childhood education, where the next generation will inherit continental governance based on principles of mutual aid rather than competition. The painted sign at Terminus's gate still promises sanctuary for all who arrive, but now that promise extends across a continent where 47 allied communities coordinate resources and support, where democracy functions across vast distances, where children grow up assuming that communities naturally help each other solve problems. Rick's final thoughts before sleep focus not on the journey that brought them here, but on the journey his grandchildren will take from here, inheriting not just security, but the tools and knowledge to continue building, to face whatever challenges the future might bring with cooperation rather than competition, trust rather than fear, community rather than isolation. Outside his window, communication arrays broadcast coordination signals to communities from California to Maine. Children's laughter echoes from playgrounds designed for joy rather than defense, and the sound of his granddaughter breathing easy represents a generation that will take peace for granted in the way his generation once took for granted that communities naturally helped each other. The legacy of peace spreads across a continent where painted signs no longer promise sanctuary because sanctuary has become the normal state of human community, where those who arrive don't just survive, but thrive, where trust turned out to be the most practical foundation for rebuilding civilization. 5 years after arriving at Terminus, Rick Grimes falls asleep knowing they chose correctly. Trust over fear, community over isolation, cooperation over competition. And that choice created a world where children can dream of futures beyond mere survival, where civilization means building together rather than taking from each other, where peace is no longer a desperate hope, but a legacy passed confidently to the next generation.